Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know in comments where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. Moving day had always been an exhilarating yet exhausting experience for me, but this one was different. This time, I wasn't just packing up memories or lugging boxes across town, I was starting over. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start, and this old house, with its weathered charm and questionable price tag, seemed to be the perfect place to begin again. The moving truck rumbled away as I stood on the cracked sidewalk, staring up at the faded Victorian house. Its peeling paint, sagging porch, and warped windows gave it a tired, forlorn look, but I saw potential. It felt like the kind of place where a person could disappear into their own world for a while. The realtor had been vague about the house's history, but I figured that was normal for a property this old. It had been sitting on the market for months, and honestly, the discount outweighed any lingering concerns about its quirks. As I stepped inside for the first time alone, the house greeted me with a symphony of creaks and groans. The wooden floorboards protested beneath my sneakers, and a faint smell of mildew and old wood filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, just different. The previous tenants had left behind a few odds and ends: an ancient armchair in the corner of the living room, a tarnished mirror leaning against the wall, and a dusty box of trinkets shoved under the staircase. I wandered through the rooms, imagining how I would fill the space. The high ceilings and narrow hallways gave the house a certain character, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement. The upstairs bedrooms were small but cozy, and the master bedroom had a large window overlooking the overgrown backyard. The attic door at the end of the hall caught my eye, but I decided to leave that exploration for another day. After a few hours of unpacking, I took a break on the creaky front porch with a cup of coffee. The neighborhood was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a passing car reminded me I wasn't completely alone. Just as I was about to head back inside, an older woman from the house next door waved at me from her garden. "Hello there," she called out, her voice cheerful but tinged with curiosity. "You're the new tenant, huh?" "Yes, just moved in today," I replied, walking over to the fence that separated our yards. "Well, welcome to the neighborhood," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Name's Mrs. Carlyle. I've lived here for nearly 40 years, so if you need anything, just holler." "Thanks, I appreciate that," I said, smiling. "It's a bit of a fixer-upper, but I think I'll make it work." Mrs. Carlyle's expression shifted slightly, her smile faltering for just a moment. "It's a beautiful house," she said slowly, her eyes flicking toward the upstairs windows. "But it's had its share of stories, you know." "Stories?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, nothing to worry about," she said quickly, waving a hand dismissively. "Old houses like that always come with a bit of history. Just strange things here and there. The folks who lived there before you didn't stay long, that's all." "What kind of strange things?" I pressed, my curiosity piqued. Mrs. Carlyle hesitated, her gaze drifting to the house again. "Footsteps at odd hours, doors that wouldn't stay shut, that sort of thing. They always said it was just the house settling, but, well, they left in quite a hurry." She gave me a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I'm sure you'll be fine. Let me know if you need help with anything." I thanked her and returned to the house, her words echoing in my mind. Strange things. Footsteps. It was probably just neighborhood gossip, I told myself. Every old house had its quirks, and I wasn't about to let a few ghost stories ruin my fresh start. That night, as I settled into bed, the house seemed quieter than before. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound seem amplified. The groan of the wind against the windows, the faint creak of the floorboards in the hall, it was all perfectly normal. At least that's what I kept telling myself. As I drifted off to sleep, a sudden, faint noise pulled me back to consciousness. It sounded like the floorboards creaking, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was walking down the hall. My heart began to race, but I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. After a few moments, the sound stopped and the silence returned. "It's just the house," I whispered to myself, pulling the covers up to my chin. Just the house settling. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been standing just outside my door. The next morning, I chalked up the noises to my overactive imagination. Moving was stressful, and I'd hardly gotten a good night's sleep since the divorce. After all, Mrs. Carlyle's stories were probably just neighborhood folklore meant to keep kids entertained or scare off superstitious buyers. I told myself I wouldn't let it bother me. The house was bathed in sunlight now, and its flaws seemed less menacing. The kitchen, with its chipped tiles and outdated appliances, felt cozy as I made coffee. The living room, where I'd set up my couch and a few boxes, seemed inviting. Even the faint smell of mildew seemed to have lessened, replaced by the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. I spent most of the day unpacking, trying to make the space my own. By mid-afternoon, I had hung some pictures, organized the bookshelves, and even cleaned out the dusty box under the stairs. It was full of random odds and ends, old postcards, yellowed photographs, a broken pocket watch, but one item stood out, a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was scuffed and worn, the edges frayed with age. Curious, I flipped it open, but the pages were blank. For a moment, I thought about tossing it, but something stopped me. Instead, I set it on the mantel above the fireplace, a peculiar decoration for a peculiar house. That evening, I decided to explore the backyard. The overgrown grass and tangled bushes gave it an untamed look, and the wrought iron fence that surrounded the property was rusted and partially collapsed in places. At the very back, hidden beneath a canopy of gnarled trees, I discovered a small stone well. The circular stones were moss-covered and crumbling, and the opening was sealed with a heavy wooden lid. I stared at it for a moment, a chill running down my spine. The well seemed out of place, almost as though it had been forgotten by time. I gave the lid an experimental tug, but it didn't budge. Deciding it was best left alone, I turned back toward the house, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. As dusk fell, the house seemed to shift around me. The floorboards creaked more often, the shadows seemed to stretch farther, and the faint smell of mildew returned, stronger this time. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on arranging furniture and hanging curtains. By the time I was ready for bed, I was exhausted. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying Mrs. Carlyle's words. Strange things. Footsteps. I shook my head, annoyed with myself for letting my imagination run wild. The house was old, yes, but it wasn't haunted. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again, a low, deliberate creak from the hallway. My heart thudded in my chest, but I told myself to stay calm. Houses made noises. That's all this was. But then came another creak, closer this time. And then another. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped just outside my door. My eyes flicked to the thin sliver of light beneath the doorframe, and my blood ran cold. A shadow passed by, slow and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was pacing just beyond the threshold. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. When I finally mustered the courage to swing my legs over the bed and step onto the floor, the boards beneath me groaned loudly, breaking the silence. I winced, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly I turned it and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the faint yellow glow of the night light I'd plugged in earlier. The air felt colder though, and there was an odd smell, something sharp and metallic like rust. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence before finally convincing myself it was nothing. I closed the door and crawled back into bed, leaving the flashlight on my phone shining weakly against the ceiling. The next morning I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I'd been half asleep, imagining things. Maybe the house was just settling, as old houses often do. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. That afternoon, I decided to take Mrs. Carlyle up on her offer of help. I walked over to her house and knocked on the door. She answered quickly, her warm smile tinged with curiosity. "Everything all right?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, I guess," I said, hesitating. "I was just wondering, you mentioned something about the house's history the other day. Do you know anything more about that?" Mrs. Carlyle's expression darkened slightly. She invited me inside, leading me to a cozy kitchen that smelled of freshly baked bread. She poured us both a cup of tea and sat down across from me. "I don't know much," she admitted, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "Just bits and pieces. The house was built back in the late 1800s by a man named Elias Thatcher. He was an odd one, kept to himself mostly. Folks said he was obsessed with strange things." "Strange things?" I prompted. "Rituals, seances, the occult," she said, lowering her voice. "He claimed he could communicate with spirits, and some people believed him. Others thought he was just a lunatic. After he died, the house sat empty for years, and when people finally started moving in, well, let's just say they didn't stay long. Why not? I asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Carlyle hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window. They said they heard things, saw things. One tenant claimed she woke up in the middle of the night to find someone standing at the foot of her bed. But when she turned on the light, there was no one there. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to dismiss her words as gossip, but they struck too close to what I'd experienced the night before. Do you think there's any truth to it? I asked quietly. Mrs. Carlyle shrugged, her expression unreadable. I think some places hold on to things. Memories maybe. Or worse. Be careful, dear. That house has a way of getting under your skin. I thanked her and returned home, her words replaying in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel like the house was watching me, its creaks and groans more deliberate than before. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. Footsteps. The footsteps came again that night, louder and more deliberate. They started at the far end of the hallway, pacing slowly toward my bedroom. I clutched my blanket tightly, my breath caught in my throat. Each step sent a fresh wave of fear through me, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound stopped just outside my door. I stared at the faint light under the door frame, my eyes wide and unblinking. A shadow moved just like before, slow, deliberate pacing. This time I couldn't convince myself it was the house settling. There was something, or someone, out there. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't make me feel any safer. My mind raced with possibilities, an intruder, a prank, or maybe, just maybe, something far worse. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight and I winced at the sound. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. What if I opened it and found nothing? Or worse, something I couldn't explain? I inhaled sharply and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The night light cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, but there was no sign of anyone or anything there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight scanning every corner. The air was icy, far colder than it should have been, and the metallic smell from before lingered, sharper now. A sudden creak behind me made me whirl around, my flashlight shaking. Nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching into the darkness. I told myself it was my imagination, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew better. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I considered calling someone, anyone, to come stay with me. But who would believe me? I could already imagine the skepticism in their voices. It's just an old house. You're overthinking it. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like it belonged to something else. Something I couldn't see but could feel, lurking just beyond my perception. Later that day, I decided to distract myself by running errands. As I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed a man standing on the sidewalk, staring at the house. He was tall and thin, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Something about him made my skin crawl. I rolled down my window. "Can I help you?" The man didn't answer right away. His eyes, dark and sunken, flicked toward me. "You live here now?" "Yes," I said cautiously. "Why?" He took a step closer, his expression grim. "You should leave. That house, it's not safe." I frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing at the house as though it might overhear him. "I used to live there. Years ago. Worst mistake of my life. There's something in that house, something that doesn't want anyone there. It's patient, but it doesn't like to be ignored." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I sat there for a moment, stunned. His words echoed in my mind, a cold knot of fear forming in my stomach. When I returned home, I found myself scanning the house more closely, looking for anything out of place. The creaks in the floorboards seemed louder, the shadows darker. Even the smell of mildew felt more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop at my door. They continued down the hallway, descending the stairs. My heart raced as I listened, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. but I stayed frozen in bed, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The sound stopped abruptly, followed by a low, guttural noise, a growl deep and primal. My stomach churned, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I didn't move, didn't breathe, terrified that whatever was downstairs might come back up. Eventually, the house fell silent again. But I didn't sleep. I lay awake, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the next sound. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows and questioning my sanity. I remembered the leather-bound notebook I'd found under the stairs and decided to take a closer look. The pages were blank, just as I'd thought. But as I flipped through them, I noticed faint impressions, words that had been written and then erased. Holding the pages up to the light, I could just barely make out the faint, spidery handwriting. It wasn't in English. The symbols and letters were unfamiliar, jagged, and uneven. I felt a strange sense of dread as I stared at them, like I was looking at something I wasn't meant to see. My hands shook as I closed the notebook and set it aside. That afternoon, I called Mrs. Carlyle again. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm but concerned. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "That notebook I found, it's strange. Do you know if Elias Thatcher kept any journals or wrote anything down?" Mrs. Carlyle was silent for a moment. "He was known to keep a diary, but no one ever found it after he died. Some folks say it was burned, but others think it's still in the house, hidden somewhere. What if I told you I found something?" I asked hesitantly. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Then you need to be very careful. Whatever Thatcher was involved in, it wasn't natural." That night, I decided to search the house more thoroughly. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt compelled, as though the house itself was urging me on. I started in the basement, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. I ran my hand along the walls, looking for anything unusual. Finally, in the far corner, I found it, a loose stone, slightly protruding from the rest. My heart pounded as I pried it loose, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was another notebook, identical to the one I'd found before. But this one wasn't blank. The pages were filled with dense, cramped handwriting and strange symbols. The words seemed to blur and shift as I tried to read them, making my head ache. As I flipped through the pages, I realized they weren't just notes or observations. They were instructions, rituals, incantations, diagrams of symbols and sigils. My stomach turned as I read, the oppressive feeling in the room growing stronger. And then I saw it, a single sentence scrawled in bold letters across the final page. "What is open cannot be closed." A sudden, deafening bang echoed through the house, and the flashlight slipped from my hands. The basement plunged into darkness, and I felt the air around me grow colder, heavier. I wasn't alone. I stood frozen in the basement, the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. My breathing was shallow, and my pulse hammered in my ears as I strained to listen for any sound beyond the deafening silence. The notebook lay open on the floor, its cryptic contents taunting me in the faint glow of the dropped flashlight. The air shifted. It wasn't a breeze, there was no draft in the basement. It was as if the very atmosphere had grown alive, pulsating with an unseen presence. My chest tightened, and I felt an inexplicable weight pressing down on me, like invisible hands squeezing the air from my lungs. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. A whisper. Low and guttural, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The language was indecipherable, the syllables sharp and disjointed, scraping against my sanity. My first instinct was to run, to flee up the stairs and out of the house, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, as though the basement itself was holding me captive. The whisper grew louder, swelling into a cacophony of overlapping voices. Some were angry, others mournful, and some carried a malevolent glee that made my skin crawl. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. They were calling to me, summoning me deeper into the darkness. "No," I muttered, my voice trembling. "This isn't real. It's just my imagination." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The whispers were too vivid, too palpable to be a product of my mind. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I snatched the flashlight off the floor and pointed it toward the source of the sound. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stone walls and the floor cluttered with debris. There was no one there. No figures, no shadows, just the empty basement. And yet, the whispers continued, circling around me like vultures waiting for their prey. I stumbled backward, clutching the notebook to my chest as I fumbled for the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity, the weight of the unseen presence following me every inch of the way. When I finally burst into the hallway, I slammed the basement door shut and leaned against it, gasping for air. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the house was eerily silent, but the oppressive feeling didn't leave. It lingered, coiling around me like a serpent, its presence undeniable. I stared at the notebook in my hands, the leather cover now slick with sweat. I wanted to throw it away, to burn it, but a part of me knew that wouldn't solve anything. This wasn't just about the notebook, it was the house, the very foundation of it. Whatever had been unleashed here, it wasn't confined to a single object. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but my mind kept returning to the cryptic phrase in the notebook. What is opened cannot be closed. It was a warning, clear and dire. But what had been opened? And by whom? Mrs. Carlyle's words echoed in my mind. Elias Thatcher. The name now carried an ominous weight, as though simply thinking it was enough to invite danger. I resolved to learn more about him, to piece together the fragments of his life and understand what had happened in this house. The local library became my refuge. I spent hours poring over old newspapers, property records, and anything else that might hold a clue. Thatcher's name appeared frequently, always in connection with the house. He had been a recluse, a man of peculiar habits who rarely ventured beyond the property. Neighbors had described him as eccentric at best, unhinged at worst. One article dated decades ago caught my eye. It described the mysterious disappearance of several townspeople, all of whom had last been seen near Thatcher's house. The article hinted at foul play but offered no concrete evidence. Thatcher had been questioned but never charged. He died shortly afterward, his death as enigmatic as his life. Then, tucked away in a dusty file, I found it, a photograph of Elias Thatcher standing in front of the house. His eyes were dark and piercing, his expression one of quiet menace. But what struck me most was the faint, almost imperceptible figure in the background, a shadowy shape barely discernible among the trees. It wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong, the limbs too long, the posture too unnatural. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the photograph. Whatever Thatcher had been involved in, it wasn't just superstition or paranoia. It was real. I returned home that evening with more questions than answers. The house loomed before me, its dark windows like unblinking eyes. The oppressive feeling returned the moment I stepped inside, heavier now, as though the house knew I was uncovering its secrets. That night, the whispers came again. But they weren't confined to the basement this time. They were everywhere, in the walls, the floor, the very air. I could feel them vibrating through the house, their intensity growing with each passing second. And then came the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving up the stairs with an agonizing precision. I locked my bedroom door, my hands trembling as I pressed my ear against the wood. The footsteps stopped just outside and I heard a faint, raspy breathing. I backed away, my heart pounding. The room grew colder and I could see my breath misting in the air. And then, without warning, the door handle began to turn. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This isn't happening." The handle rattled violently, as though whatever was on the other side was trying to force its way in. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and held it up like a weapon, my knees threatening to give out beneath me. The rattling stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing came. Eventually, I sank to the floor, clutching the lamp and staring at the door, too terrified to move. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty, the faint light of morning casting long shadows on the walls. But the sense of unease remained, a constant reminder that I was no longer alone in this house. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. But leaving felt like admitting defeat, like giving in to whatever malevolent force was tormenting me. And yet, deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't a battle I could win. The house had claimed me just as it had claimed those before me. And it wasn't finished yet. I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was sharp, deliberate, and unrelenting, echoing through the house like a cruel reminder that I was never alone. For a moment, I thought it was just a lingering remnant of the nightmare I had barely escaped from. But no, it was real. The knocking continued, loud and insistent, coming from the front door this time. I glanced at the clock. 6:02 a.m. The pale morning light seeped through the curtains, casting an eerie glow over the room. I hesitated for a long moment before dragging myself out of bed, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay put. As I descended the stairs, the knocking grew more erratic, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was losing patience. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I half expected the door to fling itself open the moment I touched it, but it didn't. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking in protest, and peered outside. No one was there. The front porch was empty, the street beyond deserted in the early morning quiet. A chill wind rustled the leaves scattered across the driveway, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell I couldn't place. I stepped outside cautiously, looking left and right, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. That was when I noticed it. A package sat on the porch, wrapped in faded brown paper and tied with a piece of fraying twine. It looked ancient, as though it had been sitting there for decades, waiting for this exact moment. My instincts screamed at me not to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up, the weight of it heavier than I'd expected, and carried it inside. I placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, debating whether or not to open it. The twine was brittle, and the paper felt rough and damp, like it had been left out in the rain. There was no return address, no markings of any kind, just a faint, circular symbol drawn in dark ink on the top. The symbol looked eerily familiar, but I couldn't quite place where I had seen it before. Taking a deep breath, I untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe under the light. My fingers hovered over the lid, hesitant to open it, but something compelled me to push forward. The lid creaked as it lifted, revealing a single item inside, a key. It was old and tarnished, its metal darkened with age. But there was something strange about it. Etched along the shaft were the same symbols that adorned the box, their meaning just as elusive. I held it up to the light, studying the intricate design, and that's when I saw the note tucked beneath the velvet lining of the box. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as though written in haste or under duress. The message was short, but it chilled me to the core. The lock waits. Do not keep it waiting too long. I stared at the note, the words sinking in like lead. The lock. What lock? And why did I feel as though the key was meant for something far more sinister than any door or chest? I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, unable to shake the feeling that the key and the box were connected to the house's dark history. I scoured every room, searching for any sign of a lock that matched the key, but there was nothing. At least not at first. It wasn't until night fell that I discovered it. I was back in the basement, drawn there by a sense of unease I couldn't ignore. The flashlight beam danced across the walls as I inspected every crevice, every crack, looking for something, anything, that might explain the presence of the key. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw it. A small, iron door embedded in the stone wall. It was barely noticeable, hidden behind a stack of crumbling boxes and old furniture. My heart raced as I cleared the debris, revealing the door in its entirety. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, its surface covered in the same swirling patterns as the key. The air around it felt different, heavier, as though the very space was alive with anticipation. The lock was at the center of the door, its shape an exact match for the key in my pocket. I hesitated, the weight of the key suddenly feeling like a curse in my hand. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to walk away and never look back. But something else, a darker, more insistent voice, whispered that I had come too far to turn back now. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock. The moment it clicked into place, a low, resonant hum filled the basement. The air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows across the walls. The door began to tremble, the metal groaning as though protesting its own existence. And then, with a deafening crack, it swung open. Beyond the door was darkness, thick, impenetrable, and alive. It seemed to reach out toward me, tendrils of shadow slithering across the floor. The hum grew louder, morphing into a chorus of whispers that filled my ears, my mind, my very soul. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the shadows spilled into the room. They moved with purpose, coiling around me like vines, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever I had unlocked, it wasn't meant to be seen, much less unleashed. But it was too late. As the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, I realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted, It was a prison, a seal meant to contain something far older and far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. And I had just set it free. I staggered backward, desperate to escape the shadows that writhed and pulsed in the basement. The air was thick, oppressive, filled with a suffocating cold that sank into my bones. The whispers grew louder, chaotic, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My flashlight flickered violently, its beam barely penetrating the inky darkness spilling from beyond the iron door. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The shadows froze, suspended in the air like ink in water. The whispers fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that was even more unnerving. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic thud of my heartbeat. For a brief, fleeting moment I thought it was over, that whatever I had unleashed had retreated back into the abyss. But I was wrong. A shape began to form within the darkness. At first it was nothing more than a vague outline, a distortion of the air that shimmered and pulsed. But as it drew closer, it became solid, tangible, and horrifying. It was tall, impossibly so, its figure hunched and twisted like a broken marionette. Its limbs were elongated, unnaturally thin, and its face, if it could be called that, was a void, an empty, featureless expanse that seemed to absorb the light around it. The shadows around me recoiled as the figure stepped through the iron door, its movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by a primal fear that gripped me like a vice. The figure tilted its head as though studying me, and then it spoke. The voice was a low, guttural rasp, like the grinding of stone against stone. It didn't speak in words, but I understood it all the same. It wasn't asking for permission or forgiveness. It was making a statement, a declaration of its return. "You opened the door." The words reverberated in my skull, a cruel reminder of my mistake. My knees buckled, and I fell to the cold, damp floor, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. The figure took another step forward, and the air around it grew colder, the temperature plummeting with each passing second. Frost began to form on the walls, the floor, even my skin. And then it reached for me. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, was little more than a clawed shadow, its edges frayed and shifting. As it stretched toward me, I felt an overwhelming pull, as though it were trying to drag me into the darkness with it. Panic surged through me, and in a last desperate act of defiance, I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the stairs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispers resumed as I fled, rising to a deafening crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. I burst into the main floor, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the lock, but it was pointless. Whatever was down there wasn't bound by locks or doors. I stumbled into the living room, gasping for air, and collapsed onto the couch. My mind was racing, my thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and disbelief. What had I done? What had I unleashed? The house felt different now, darker, heavier. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. And then the knocking started again. It wasn't at the front door this time. It was coming from inside the house. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The sound was faint at first, a soft, deliberate tapping that echoed through the empty halls. But it grew louder, more insistent, moving from room to room as though searching for something, or someone. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was blank. No signal, no power, nothing. The battery had been fully charged just hours ago, but now it was dead, as though the very energy had been drained from it. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed down on me like a weight. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere upstairs. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted out of the house, the cold night air biting at my skin as I stumbled onto the front lawn. The street was empty, the neighboring houses dark and silent. I turned back toward the house, expecting to see the figure in the window, but there was nothing. Just the faint glow of the porch light and the oppressive shadow of the house looming behind it. For a moment, I thought about running to the neighbor who had warned me about the house, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I felt rooted to the spot, as though leaving the property would somehow make things worse. Instead, I sat on the curb, my head in my hands, and waited for dawn. When the sun finally rose, its light banishing the shadows, I forced myself to go back inside. The house was silent, the oppressive atmosphere gone. But the basement door was open. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The iron door was still there, but it was shut, the key nowhere to be found. The shadows were gone, the whispers silent, but the cold lingered, a stark reminder of what had happened. I knew I couldn't stay. The house had been a mistake, a trap I had walked into willingly. Whatever was down there, whatever I had unleashed, it wasn't over. It never would be. As I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move just out of sight, the faint smell of sulfur lingering in the air. And as I closed the front door for the last time, I swore I heard the whisper start again, faint and distant, calling out to me. You opened the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not for me. Not for the next person who would inevitably find themselves drawn to the house and its cursed history. The door was waiting, and it wouldn't wait forever. The drive away from the house felt surreal, like waking from a nightmare only to realize the dread had followed me into the daylight. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel as I clutched it, my suitcase stuffed haphazardly into the back seat. The house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, its dark silhouette a menacing blot against the morning sky. But even as I drove further and further away, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. Not by a car or a person, but by something far less tangible. My skin prickled with an invisible weight, and every now and then, I'd glance at the mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure hunched in the back seat. The feeling stayed with me all the way to the motel, where I checked in with shaky hands. The clerk, a tired-looking man with a gruff demeanor, barely glanced at me as he handed over the key to my room. I didn't care about his indifference. I just needed somewhere to collapse, to catch my breath and figure out what to do next. The room was small and smelled faintly of bleach, but it felt safe, or at least safer than the house. I locked the door behind me, sliding the flimsy chain into place, and sank onto the bed. My body felt heavy, like the weight of the last few days had finally caught up with me. But rest didn't come easily. Even in the daylight, the whispers lingered in my mind, faint and insidious. I couldn't stop replaying the events of the night before. The shadowy figure, the iron door, the cold, clawed hand reaching for me. I could still feel the icy grip of its presence, hear the grinding voice that had spoken those damning words. You opened the door. What did it mean? Why had the house targeted me? I thought back to the journal I'd found in the basement. I had left it behind in my panic, but the memories of its contents were burned into my mind. The rituals, the incantations, the warnings scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting. The house had always been cursed, its original owner dabbling in forces no human was meant to understand. But there was something more to it, something the journal hadn't revealed. I could feel it like an itch in the back of my mind, a piece of the puzzle I was still missing. Despite my exhaustion, I couldn't stay still. I grabbed my laptop and began searching for anything I could find about the house. Its history, its past owners, the people who had lived there before me. It was a desperate attempt to make sense of the chaos, to find some kind of answer that might explain what I had unleashed. What I found only made my dread deepen. The house had a history of tragedy, its tenants plagued by misfortune and madness. One article described a family who had lived there in the 1970s, their youngest daughter disappearing without a trace. Another detailed the story of a man found dead in the basement, his body covered in strange, indecipherable symbols. But it was a forum post from 10 years ago that made my blood run cold. The post was written by a woman who claimed to have lived in the house briefly before fleeing in terror. She described the same phenomena I had experienced, the whispers, the footsteps, the oppressive cold. But her account went further, detailing a presence that grew stronger the longer she stayed. It feeds on you, she had written, on your fear, your despair. It doesn't just haunt you, it consumes you. The post ended abruptly, with no indication of what had happened to her. But the final sentence stuck with me, an ominous warning that echoed in my mind. The door is a gateway, but it's not just for it to come through. It's for you to go to it. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling. I couldn't do this. Not now, not when every shadow in the room felt like it was watching me. I needed to clear my head, to get out of this room before I drove myself insane. The sun was setting as I stepped outside, the sky streaked with shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp and cool, a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the house. I walked aimlessly, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. The streets were empty, the sidewalks deserted, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement, just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting behind a tree, a flicker of motion in a darkened window. By the time I returned to the motel, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world into darkness. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me and checking the windows twice. But the sense of security was short-lived. As I lay in bed, the whispers returned. Faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing moment. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling the room with their insidious murmur. I buried my head under the pillow, desperate to block them out, but it was useless. The whispers weren't just in the room, they were in my mind, seeping into my thoughts like poison. And then I felt it. The bed shifted, the mattress dipping under the weight of something, or someone. My breath caught in my throat as the cold seeped through the blankets, chilling me to the bone. I didn't dare move. The weight grew heavier, the presence pressing down on me like a physical force. And then I felt it, a hand, icy and clawed, brushing against my shoulder. I screamed, bolting upright and scrambling off the bed. The room was empty, the whispers gone, but the cold remained, an unshakable reminder of what had just happened. I couldn't stay here. Grabbing my bag, I fled the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The night air was cold against my skin as I climbed into my car and drove, the motel shrinking into the distance behind me. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still with me, waiting, watching. And I knew deep down that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I drove aimlessly through the night, the darkened road stretching endlessly before me. The headlights of my car carved weak paths through the inky blackness, but they did nothing to dispel the oppressive feeling that clung to me like a second skin. My hands trembled on the wheel, my knuckles aching from the tight grip I maintained out of sheer terror. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to keep moving. Stopping wasn't an option, not with the thing from the house still lingering in my mind. The cold sensation of its clawed hand brushing against my shoulder refused to leave me, a phantom touch that made my skin crawl. As the hours ticked by, exhaustion began to take its toll. My eyelids grew heavy, and the faint hum of the engine became a lullaby I struggled to resist. The adrenaline that had kept me alert was waning, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that made it harder and harder to focus. I needed to stop. Eventually, I pulled into a rest area off the highway. It was deserted, the only illumination coming from a single flickering street lamp. The eerie silence of the place sent a shiver down my spine, but I was too tired to care. I reclined the driver's seat and closed my eyes, hoping for even a few moments of peace. But peace wasn't something I could have anymore. As I drifted off, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the car with their cacophony. Come back. You can't run. The door is still open. My eyes snapped open, my heart hammering in my chest. The car was empty, the rest area still shrouded in darkness. But the whispers lingered, echoing in my mind like a cruel taunt. I couldn't stay here. Fumbling with the keys, I started the car and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt that seemed to lead nowhere. The darkness pressed in around me, the headlights barely piercing through its suffocating depths. It wasn't long before the hallucinations began. At first, they were small, shadows flitting across the road, indistinct shapes that vanished as soon as I focused on them. But they grew bolder, more vivid, until I was seeing figures standing in the middle of the highway, their hollow eyes staring directly at me. I swerved to avoid them, the tires screeching as the car veered dangerously close to the edge of the road. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking as I tried to steady the wheel. This isn't real, I muttered to myself. It's just in your head. But it felt real. Too real. The figures didn't stop appearing, their forms becoming more defined with each passing mile. They stood in the road, lined up like sentinels, their faces obscured by shadows. And yet, I could feel their eyes on me, boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. By the time I reached the outskirts of a small town, I was on the verge of collapse. My body ached with exhaustion, my mind frayed from the constant barrage of fear and paranoia. The town itself was unremarkable, a collection of dimly lit streets and shuttered storefronts. I pulled into the parking lot of a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. The sight of it was oddly comforting. a small beacon of normalcy in the midst of my nightmare. Inside, the diner was almost empty. A tired-looking waitress stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, while an older man nursed a cup of coffee in one of the booths. The warm, greasy smell of frying bacon and hash browns filled the air, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. I took a seat at the counter, my hands still trembling as I picked up the menu. The waitress glanced at me, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, unable to muster the energy for a proper response. She didn't press further, instead taking my order and disappearing into the kitchen. I stared down at the counter, my mind racing with thoughts of the house and the thing that had followed me. When the food arrived, I picked at it absently, my appetite non-existent. The older man in the booth got up to leave, pausing briefly to glance in my direction. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You came from the house, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. My head snapped up, my blood turning to ice. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, a grim expression on his face. "I've seen it before," he said. "People who've been there. They all look like you, haunted." I felt a surge of panic, my pulse racing as his words sank in. "What do you know about it?" I demanded. He hesitated, glancing around the diner as if afraid of being overheard. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The house isn't just haunted," he said. "It's cursed. The man who built it, he did things no one should ever do. Open doors that should have stayed closed. And once you've been there, it doesn't let you go." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "Is there a way to stop it?" I asked. His expression darkened, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. "Maybe," he said, "but it'll come at a cost. You have to go back, to face it, to close the door for good." The thought of returning to the house sent a wave of dread through me, but I knew he was right. Running wasn't an option. Whatever I had unleashed, it wouldn't stop until it was dealt with. The waitress returned to clear my plate, breaking the tense silence. By the time I looked back at the man, he was gone, leaving only his empty coffee cup behind. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I felt a renewed sense of determination. I didn't know how, but I would end this, even if it killed me. The drive back to the house felt like an act of surrender. The further I went, the tighter the grip of dread became, wrapping itself around my chest like a steel band. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to keep driving until the house and everything tied to it was nothing but a distant memory. But the man's words haunted me. "You have to go back, to face it, to close the door for good." I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to go back. But deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever door the original owner of the house had opened, it was still ajar. And the longer it stayed that way, the more certain I became that it wasn't just the house that was cursed. It was me. When I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before me like a dark, hulking predator. The windows, once welcoming portals to the outside world, now seemed like hollow eyes, watching me with malicious intent. The air was heavy with silence. Not the kind of peaceful silence you find in the countryside, but a stifling, oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on everything. Even the wind had stilled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to stay where I was, to lock the doors and wait for daylight. But daylight wouldn't save me. Finally, I forced myself out of the car. My legs felt like lead as I approached the front door, the gravel crunching beneath my feet unnaturally loud in the stillness. The moment I stepped inside, the air seemed to change. It was colder than I remembered, and the faint smell of decay that had plagued me since I first moved in was stronger now, almost suffocating. I closed the door behind me, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. The house was waiting. I could feel it. I didn't bother turning on the lights. They wouldn't help me now. Instead, I made my way to the study, the place where I had found the journal, the place where this nightmare had begun. The door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl. The study was just as I had left it, the bookshelves lined with ancient tomes and the desk cluttered with papers. But the atmosphere was different, felt alive. The journal was still there, sitting on the desk like an invitation. I hesitated before picking it up, the leather cover cold and slick beneath my fingers. Flipping through its pages, I stopped at a passage I had skimmed over before, too overwhelmed by fear to read it closely. The door is open and it cannot be closed by ordinary means. To seal it, one must offer a sacrifice. Blood for blood. Life for life. My stomach turned as the meaning of the word sank in. A sacrifice. That was the price of closing the door. But whose life? As if in answer, the floorboards creaked behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was deliberate, heavy, like the steps of someone, or something far larger than any human. Slowly I turned around. The figure standing in the doorway was a shadow, its form indistinct but unmistakably menacing. It was tall, its head nearly brushing the top of the door frame, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, 2 pinpoints of malevolent light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around me grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, paralyzing me where I stood. The shadow moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. With each step, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the cold biting into my skin like needles. It stopped just a few feet away from me, its presence suffocating. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it spoke. Its voice was a guttural, inhuman growl, like the grinding of stone against stone. You opened the door. I couldn't respond. My throat was dry, my body trembling with fear. You must pay the price, it said. The journal fell from my hands, landing on the floor with a thud that echoed through the room. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, trying to find a way out. What do you want? I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. The shadow tilted its head as if considering my question. Then it raised an arm, if it could even be called that, and pointed toward the journal on the floor. I followed its gesture, my eyes landing on the open page. The words seemed to glow faintly, their meaning clearer now than ever before. Blood for blood. Life for life. It wanted a sacrifice. A sudden, horrifying realization dawned on me. It wasn't just asking for any sacrifice. It wanted me to give up my own life. The shadow took another step closer and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the desk. My heart was pounding, my mind screaming at me to run, but I knew there was nowhere to go. Please, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. There has to be another way. The shadow didn't respond. It simply stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on me with an intensity that felt like it could pierce through my very soul. In that moment, I realized the truth. There was no escaping this. No running, no hiding. The house wouldn't let me go, not unless I gave it what it wanted. But I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I grabbed the journal from the floor and bolted past the shadow, my legs carrying me out of the study and down the hall. The house seemed to come alive around me, the walls groaning and the floorboards buckling beneath my feet. Behind me, I could hear the shadow following, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. I didn't look back. Bursting out the front door, I ran into the night, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The cold air stung my lungs, but I didn't stop until I reached my car. Slamming the door shut, I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, the tires screeching against the pavement. As the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, I felt a momentary sense of relief. But then I heard it. A whisper. Faint but unmistakable. You can't run forever. I didn't sleep that night. The drive had been a blur, a mix of panic and exhaustion, and even when I reached the safety of my apartment, the weight of what had happened in that house didn't lift. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside, seemed to remind me that I wasn't truly free. I kept thinking about the shadow. Its words had burned into my mind. You can't run forever, and I knew it was right. Days passed, but the sense of being hunted never left me. I moved through life on autopilot, going to work, running errands, trying to pretend that things were normal, but all I could think about was the house, the curse, the door, the price that was still to be paid. I tried to talk to a therapist. I thought maybe I was losing my grip on reality, that it was all in my head, the shadow, the whispers, the journal. But every time I closed my eyes, the images flooded back. I couldn't escape them. Then one afternoon, I received a call that made my blood run cold. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the moment he spoke, I knew who it was. I'm sorry, the man said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of urgency. I know you're probably trying to move on, but you can't. Not yet. The curse, it's still attached to you. I dropped the phone, my heart hammering in my chest. How did he know? How did he know what had happened? I quickly picked it up again. What are you talking about? What curse? He paused for a long time, and I could hear the sound of rustling paper in the background. The house you stayed in. The one with the door. It doesn't just let go of its victims. The curse attaches itself. The entity, it follows. I felt a chill run through me, but I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I've been researching the house for years. I'm the one who warned you about the journal. I didn't know you would try to close the door, but now it's following you. And it won't stop until it gets what it wants. I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers started to ache. What does it want? The man sighed. The door is still open, and there's only one way to close it. You have to return. You have to make the sacrifice. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words felt like a death sentence. There's no other way, he continued. If you don't go back, the curse will follow you wherever you go. And eventually it will find you. I hung up. I had no choice. The next day, I found myself driving back to the house. I didn't even think about the decision. It was as if my body was moving on its own, my mind too exhausted to resist. When I reached the house, it was just as I remembered, dark, looming, silent. It was almost as if it were waiting for me. I parked the car and got out, my legs feeling numb as I walked toward the door. I had hoped that somehow the curse would have loosened its grip, but I knew it hadn't. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards sending a shiver down my spine. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the house felt cold, colder than I remembered. The journal was still on the desk in the study, just as it had been when I left. I sat down at the desk and opened it. The pages were yellowed, brittle, but still legible. I traced my fingers over the words, the sentence that had haunted me, blood for blood, life for life. There was no other choice. I could hear the house creaking around me, the walls groaning in response to the tension in the air. I could almost feel the shadow watching me, waiting. As I stood up to make my way to the door, something moved out of the corner of my eye. A shape. A dark figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the room. It wasn't the same as before. It was more solid, more real. I turned quickly, my heart in my throat, but when I looked, it was gone. But I felt it. It was here. I moved toward the door, the cold air biting at my skin, my breath fogging up in front of me. Every step I took seemed to make the house groan louder, its walls protesting as if it was alive, fighting against me. I had to end it. I had to close the door. And the only way to do that was to offer the sacrifice. I reached for the journal again, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. There had to be something I could do to escape this. Something, anything, that didn't involve giving up my life. But the answer was always the same. Blood for blood. Life for life, asterisk asterisk. There was no way out. As I sat there, staring at the words, the temperature dropped again. My breath misted in front of me, and I could feel the weight of the presence behind me. It was there. I could hear its footsteps now, slow and deliberate, approaching from the darkness. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. It was too late. I had made my decision. But as I reached for the journal to end it all, I heard it, the whisper again. You can't run forever. It was right. But now it was too late to stop. I stood up, my legs shaking, and made my way toward the door, the journal still in my hands. The shadow was closing in on me, and there was nowhere to hide. There was nothing left to do but face it, to end it all. I stood frozen in the center of the room, my eyes darting around, scanning the walls, the dark corners, the hallway that stretched endlessly behind the door. The whispering had stopped, but the presence, the weight of it, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The house felt alive again, as if the very walls were breathing, pulsating with the ancient energy that had once been sealed away. I could hear it. The slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere beyond the darkness. They weren't just in my head. They were real as the chill creeping up my spine. Each step was measured, calculated, like it was waiting for something or someone. Me. The journal in my hands trembled with each breath I took, my fingers slick with sweat as I gripped it tighter. The words were burned into my mind now. The sacrifice. Blood for blood. Life for life. I needed to close the door. The house couldn't have me. Not like this. Not after everything I had endured. But with every step I took toward the door, the weight of the curse grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel the shadow now, just behind me, its presence like a dark cloud hanging over my shoulder. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, to give in. I tried to push through it, to ignore the terror gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I had made it this far, I couldn't back down now. I stepped toward the door, my body moving on its own, as if the house itself was pulling me toward the very thing I was trying to avoid. The door. It was there just a few steps away. But as I reached for the handle, a cold, icy gust of air slammed into me, pushing me backward. The house groaned loudly, the walls trembling as though the very foundation was shaking. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught myself just in time, my hand gripping the door frame. The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching longer, swallowing up the light from the dim bulb overhead. Then I heard it. A soft, faint sound at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. But it grew louder, closer, more distinct. "Don't leave." I froze. The voice was chilling, a cold breath against my ear. It wasn't my own thoughts, wasn't some figment of my imagination. It was real. Someone, or something, was speaking to me. The shadow was closer now, standing at the threshold of the room, its shape barely visible in the dim light. But I could feel it. It was almost as if I could reach out and touch it. It was tangible, alive, moving with intent. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. They were like coals, burning red, filled with malice. And they were staring directly at me. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, my body locked in place, unable to move, unable to escape. "It's too late," the voice whispered again, this time right behind me, as if it was breathing directly into my ear. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my mouth was dry, my throat closed tight. The eyes moved closer, and I felt a cold, heavy weight settle onto the bed behind me, like something had just sat down, leaving an imprint on the sheets. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the bed, the sheets still undisturbed, the room silent once again. But the presence was undeniable. It was here. It was waiting. And it was never going to leave. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I snapped into action. I grabbed the journal, clutching it like a lifeline, and bolted toward the door. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat a frantic drum. My hands fumbled with the handle, and for a moment I thought I was trapped, locked inside with the thing that had haunted me for so long. But finally, the door creaked open, and I burst into the hallway, the darkness swallowing me whole. I ran, not even knowing where I was going, just desperate to get away from the thing that had been stalking me. But it was no use. The footsteps echoed behind me, loud and menacing, closing in faster than I could run. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls narrowing, pushing me forward, trapping me in an eternal chase. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I would see it. The shadow. The eyes. But just as I reached the stairs, something cold wrapped around my ankle, pulling me down. My body hit the floor with a sickening thud, and I screamed, my fingers scrambling against the floorboards as I tried to crawl away. I looked up, and there it was, the shadow, towering over me. Its form shifting, a dark mass that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And those eyes, those glowing red eyes, burning into my soul. It spoke, its voice deep and guttural, a sound that reverberated through my bones. "You can't escape me," and I knew it was right. But that didn't mean I was going to give up without a fight. With every ounce of strength I had left, I reached for the journal. I tore through the pages, my hands trembling as I found the final ritual, the one that would close the door, the one that would end it all. I began to chant the words, my voice trembling, my breath ragged, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The shadow was closing in, its grip tightening around my ankle, pulling me toward it. But then something strange happened. The walls began to shake. The house groaned louder and louder until it felt like it was going to collapse. The shadows recoiled, retreating back into the corners of the room. The door. It was closing. I could feel it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. Silence. I lay there, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt different now. Lighter. Almost normal. But I knew better. The house was still there. The curse was still there. And the shadow, it wasn't gone. Not really. As I stumbled out of the house, my legs weak and unsteady, I heard it one last time, the whisper carried on the wind. "You can't run forever." I knew then that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I don't know what I was expecting when I left the house. Maybe some sense of relief, maybe a feeling of escape. But all I found was a void, an emptiness that stretched out before me, swallowing me whole. I had stepped outside into the cold, but nothing felt right. The house still loomed behind me, its dark silhouette imprinted on my mind. I tried to move on. I told myself it was over. I had closed the door. I had sealed the curse. But the nagging feeling, this relentless unease, was always there, just beneath the surface, gnawing at me. It followed me wherever I went, shadowing me like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The air was colder now. The streets were empty, eerily silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the soft crunch of my shoes against the snow. I tried to focus on that, tried to calm my mind, but every footstep felt like a reminder that I wasn't free. I passed the old house once more, my eyes drawn to the dark windows that stared back at me like hollow eyes. A shiver ran down my spine. The house wasn't just abandoned, it was alive. I could feel it like a pulse beneath the ground, thrumming with a dark, insistent energy. A part of me wanted to keep walking, to distance myself from it, but I couldn't help but glance back one last time. And there it was, a figure. Just a shadow, barely visible against the darkened window. But I saw it. I saw the outline of someone standing there, watching me. I froze. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it, to return. I turned away, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to keep going. I had to escape. But the feeling didn't fade. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in that window, waiting. It felt like a warning, like it was telling me that I hadn't truly left, that the curse wasn't over. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it, the soft, deliberate footsteps echoing in the darkness. Not in the house, but outside, around me, closing in. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I had gone through so much that I was seeing things, hearing things. But I couldn't ignore the sensation. The feeling that something was there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for me to look. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, sweat slick on my skin. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You're still here." I shot out of bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice wasn't in my head. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. It was coming from somewhere just outside the door. I rushed to the door, yanking it open, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway. The silence. The same quiet that had haunted me since I first stepped into that cursed house. But the feeling remained. That oppressive weight, that ever-present sense of being watched, of being hunted. I stumbled back into the room, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing was clear. It wasn't over. The house was still with me, its curse still clinging to me like a shadow that I couldn't shake. And that's when I realized something even worse. The house wasn't just alive. It was watching me. It was following me. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold. The house was reaching out to me, pulling me back no matter how far I tried to run. I couldn't escape, and it would never let me go. I don't know how long I stayed there, trapped in my own thoughts, the fear creeping in around the edges of my sanity. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my skin crawl. It was like I was still in the house, still trapped within its walls, with no way to break free. Then a sound broke through the silence, a sound that I could never forget. The door, the one I had closed behind me. It creaked open, slowly, deliberately. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see. The darkness, the shadow, the eyes watching me. But I had to know. I had to face it. I turned toward the door, my heart in my throat. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening, crawling across the walls like living things. And there in the doorway stood the figure. It was tall, indistinct, like a silhouette made of smoke, its outline shifting and warping with a flickering light. But I could see the eyes, those burning red eyes glowing in the dark. They were fixed on me, and I knew with terrifying certainty that they were waiting for me to make a choice. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care what was behind me anymore. All I cared about was escaping, getting as far away from that house as I could. But as I ran down the street, I heard it again. The footsteps, closing in. I couldn't outrun it. No matter how far I went, no matter how fast I ran, it would follow me. Always. The curse had me, and now there was no escape. The last thing I heard as I disappeared into the night was the whisper. It's never over. The house, the shadow, the curse, they would always be with me. Story 2. The day I moved into the house on Maple Street, it was raining. Not the steady kind of rain you expect in the middle of spring, but the kind that seems to have no end. It soaked through my jacket and trickled down my neck as I carried box after box into the place I would call home for the next few months. I was recently divorced, and moving to a new town seemed like the best way to start over. A fresh start in a small, quiet place away from the noise of my old life. The house itself was old. The kind of place you can tell has seen better days but still has character. It was a 2-story structure with ivy creeping up one side, its paint peeling in places. The real estate agent had called it charming, a word I would later come to despise, but I figured it was good enough for now. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was affordable, and that's what mattered. I opened the front door for the first time and stepped into a small, dimly lit hallway. The wood floors creaked beneath my feet, and I could smell something faintly musty in the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it made me pause for a second, wondering if maybe the house needed a little more than a fresh coat of paint. Still, I shrugged it off. Old houses have their quirks, right? I spent the next few hours unpacking in silence. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the rain against the windows. As I was putting away the last of my things, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find an older woman standing on the porch. She had graying hair tied back in a loose bun and a warm, if slightly tired, smile on her face. Her clothes were old-fashioned, like something you'd see in a photograph from decades ago. "Hello there," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm Mrs. Gable. I live next door." I smiled, feeling a little embarrassed for not having introduced myself sooner. "Hi, I'm Sarah. Just moved in today." "I figured," she said, her eyes scanning the house behind me with a knowing look. "This place hasn't had a new tenant in a while." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "I just wanted to come over and say welcome," she continued, "and to warn you about the house." I raised an eyebrow, trying to gauge whether she was joking or serious. "Warn me about it?" She nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as if searching for the right words. "You might hear some strange things at night. Sounds, footsteps maybe. People have come and gone over the years, but they never stay for long. One girl, she ran out of here, terrified, babbling about curses or something. Left everything behind. It's been empty for months now." I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I didn't want to seem rude. "I'm sure it's just the house settling. It is old after all." Mrs. Gable smiled faintly, though I could see a hint of concern in her eyes. "Of course, it's probably nothing. Just don't say I didn't warn you." She gave me one last look, and then, without another word, she turned and walked back to her house. I watched her go, the unsettling feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. I shook my head, trying to shake off the odd feeling. This was just an old house with an eccentric neighbor. Nothing more. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't ignore the faint creaking sound that came from upstairs, as though someone was walking around. I dismissed it. After all, the house was old. I spent the next few days unpacking and settling into my new routine. The house had all the usual quirks of an old building, creaking floorboards, drafty windows, and odd smells that seemed to come and go, but nothing too alarming. At night, the rain would patter against the windows, and I'd hear the occasional groan of the house settling. It didn't take long before I was used to it. I started to feel like I could relax in the space. That was until the first night the footsteps began. It started out faint, just a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the house shifting or maybe an animal running across the roof. But as the sound grew louder, I began to wonder if I was hearing things. I got up, walked through the house, checking every room, but found nothing. Just the familiar creaks and sighs of the old building. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing. The house was settling, right? It was bound to make noises. But that night, the footsteps came again. Louder this time. They seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I froze, listening intently, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just the house. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued for what felt like hours, until eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Old houses make noises, I told myself. They groan and creak, especially when the weather's bad. It didn't mean anything. But deep down, a part of me wondered if Mrs. Gable had been right. Maybe there was more to this house than I had realized. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy. The house felt colder than I expected, but that could be chalked up to the weather. It wasn't exactly the warmest spring I'd ever experienced, and the old radiators barely seemed to make a dent in the chill. Still, I carried on, unpacking boxes and making the place feel a little more like home. I found a corner in the living room to set up my writing desk and tried to focus on the things that needed attention, the work I had put on hold during my divorce. This place was supposed to be a fresh start after all. But the sound, the footsteps, they didn't go away. They returned on the third night. This time, I wasn't sure if I had just grown more sensitive to it or if the noises were getting louder. I had already settled into bed, trying to block out the cold that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. I was just about to drift off when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They echoed down the hallway outside my room, each step resonating through the floorboards with a hollow sound that sent a jolt of panic through my chest. I sat up, my heart pounding. My eyes were fixed on the door, but I couldn't move. The footsteps paused just outside my room, and then, without warning, a loud bang. It came from downstairs. A door slamming? Or a window, maybe? My breath hitched in my throat, and my first instinct was to get up and check, but the fear rooted me to the bed. I stayed there, listening intently, straining to hear anything else. But there was only silence. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there in the dark, my mind running in circles. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was just the house settling again. But deep down, I knew something was different. There was a heaviness in the air, a presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Eventually, the silence became unbearable, and I pulled myself from the bed, heart still racing. I crept down the stairs cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet with every step. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated, listening for any hint of movement. The house was still too still. I glanced into the living room, but nothing seemed out of place. I checked the front door to make sure it was locked, then went through every room making sure the windows were shut tight. It all felt so normal. Too normal. As if I had just imagined it. But the moment I returned upstairs, the feeling returned. That oppressive, suffocating weight. The air felt colder. I could almost feel eyes on me watching from the dark corners of the room. I tried to shake it off, pulling the covers up to my chin and closing my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing that soft, steady tapping, the same footsteps I had heard before. They seemed to come from everywhere, echoing from the walls, the floors, the ceilings. And each time I tried to ignore it, it only grew louder, more insistent. By the time morning finally came, I was exhausted. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't alone. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure. It was a blur, too dark to make out clearly, but I could feel its presence like a shadow that was just a little too close. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. My breath came out in shaky gasps, and I bolted out of bed, checking the room. Nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. It wasn't the first time I had felt this, but it was the first time I had seen something I couldn't explain. Later that morning, I went into town to pick up a few things, needing a break from the house. I didn't want to admit it, but I was hoping to clear my head, get some perspective. I made a point to stop by the small diner on Main Street. As I sat down with a cup of coffee, trying to shake the unease from my mind, a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Sarah, right? I looked up to see Mrs. Gable standing there, her gray eyes sharp with curiosity. She took a seat across from me without waiting for an invitation. How's the house treating you? She asked, her gaze lingering on me a little too long. I hesitated, unsure how much I should share. It's fine. Just getting used to the old quirks, you know? The usual sounds of an old house. Her eyes seemed to flicker for a moment, almost like she was considering something, and then she nodded slowly. You've heard them, haven't you? I wasn't sure how to respond. What do you mean? The footsteps, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if she didn't want anyone else to overhear. The things that walk when no one's there. It's happened to everyone who's lived there. The house has its way of getting to people. It makes them see things, hear things. And the longer you stay, the harder it is to leave. I felt a chill settle in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. I'm sure it's just the house settling. Old buildings have a way of making noises. Mrs. Gable's gaze softened, but there was something else in her eyes now. It's not just the house, dear. It's the land it sits on. There's something here, something old, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. You need to know, Sarah. You need to understand what you're dealing with. I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. It was as though she was trying to warn me, but also preparing me for something I couldn't even begin to understand. What happened? I asked, almost against my will. What do you mean, disturbed? She leaned back in her chair, looking away for a moment, lost in thought. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, more measured. There's a reason that house has been abandoned. The last person who lived there, they found something. Something that shouldn't have been found. I leaned in, my curiosity piqued despite the unease crawling up my spine. What was it? But Mrs. Gable only shook her head, her eyes darkening. You'll find out soon enough. But once you know, it's too late. And with that, she stood, leaving me with more questions than answers, my hands shaking slightly as I set my cup of coffee down. What had she meant by all of that? Something about the land? About disturbing something? I wasn't sure, but as I made my way back to the house, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, crept over me once more. And deep down, I knew that whatever was in that house, whatever had been disturbed, wasn't finished with me yet. The following evening, the air in the house was thick with the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone. I couldn't shake the words Mrs. Gable had left me with, swirling in my head like smoke. Asterisk, once you know, it's too late. Asterisk. I spent the night awake, my thoughts racing, but I didn't hear the footsteps again. Still, I knew the presence was there, lurking just out of sight. The chill was constant, creeping through the house like an invisible fog, settling into every corner. The next day, I tried to push it all aside, telling myself that it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore. The smell. It had started out faint, barely noticeable, like something old and forgotten. A musty, damp odor that hung in the air. But as the days wore on, it grew stronger, more putrid. It wasn't the smell of mold or mildew, but something darker, something wrong. I couldn't place it, but it made my stomach churn every time I passed through the hall. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard something else. A low, guttural noise, almost like a whisper. It was coming from the walls, from deep inside the house. My heart pounded as I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo through my very bones. It was as though someone, was trying to reach me from the other side of the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I had to learn more about the house's history, about what Mrs. Gable had been talking about. The following afternoon, I decided to head down to the town's library. It was a small, dusty place with rows of old books and records. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to start somewhere. The librarian was an elderly woman, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she scanned the rows of books. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice warm but with a hint of caution. "I'm looking for information about a house," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's on Rosewood Street. Do you have anything on its history?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she took a step closer, lowering her voice as if she were about to share some forbidden secret. "Rosewood Street, you say? That old place." She seemed to hesitate, as if weighing whether to say more. "I'd be careful if I were you. Not much good comes from digging into its past." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I pressed on. "What do you mean? What happened there?" She glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, before pulling out a dusty old ledger from beneath the counter. She flipped through the pages, muttering to herself until she came to a stop. "There was a man. Doctor, I believe. Dr. Charles Whitley. He moved into that house about 70 years ago. He was eccentric, to say the least. Spent most of his time in the basement, studying things that most people would rather forget." The librarian shuddered, her voice growing softer with each word. "They say he was obsessed with the occult. There were rumors about strange rituals, things that should never have been done. People in town whispered about him. They said the house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. And that's why no one stays there long." I felt my stomach tighten at her words. Cursed, the word hung in the air like an echo of something long buried. I needed to know more. "Do you have anything else?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The librarian looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "There's a journal. Or rather, there was a journal. Some say it was destroyed, but others claim it's still hidden away in that house. The pages of that journal might explain everything. The rituals, the things he summoned, and the horrors that followed. If you really want to know, that's where you should look." I could feel my pulse quicken. The journal, the answer to everything. It was so close I could almost taste it. She handed me a small yellowed newspaper clipping that had been wedged between the pages of the ledger. The headline was faded, but I could make out the words, "Dr. Whitley disappears without a trace." The article was brief, but the last line stood out. Asterisk, neighbors report strange noises and sightings near the house in the days leading up to his disappearance. Authorities have no explanation for his sudden vanishing. Asterisk. My head was spinning as I left the library, clutching the clipping tightly in my hand. I needed to find that journal. I had to know what had happened to Dr. Whitley, to the house, to anyone who had lived there before me. The house wasn't just settling, it was holding on to something. Something old, something dark. That night I could feel it. The house was watching me. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold spots, it was all building to something that I couldn't escape. I decided to search the house. I started in the attic, then moved down to the basement. The air grew heavier the farther I went, each step deeper into the house feeling like a step deeper into something I couldn't understand. I checked the closets, the crawl spaces, every nook and cranny. But there was nothing. No journal, no trace of Dr. Whitley's life. Just the smell, the rotting, decaying smell that seemed to follow me wherever I went. Finally, I made my way down to the basement. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and I hesitated before stepping onto the cold concrete floor. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and as I walked further into the room, I felt something brush against the back of my neck. A presence. I wasn't alone. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. I felt the weight of something behind me, the air shifting, and then I heard it. A low whisper, just barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from the corner of the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. But as I turned to leave, my eyes caught something on the far wall. A faded, old symbol, carved into the stone. It was crude but unmistakable. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever had been summoned in that house, whatever Dr. Whitley had done, it hadn't gone away. It was still here, waiting, and it was getting closer. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of that symbol in the basement haunted me, its jagged lines seared into my mind. I kept replaying the events over and over, but the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the feeling of being watched crept into every corner of the house. It was like a heavy weight on my chest that wouldn't let up. The next morning, I tried to act like everything was fine. I brewed coffee, went through the motions, but the unease lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. I didn't dare venture into the basement again, not yet. I couldn't. But the thought of Dr. Whitley and his journal gnawed at me, urging me to search deeper, to dig into whatever dark thing he had brought into this house. Around midday, I decided to stop by Mrs. Gable's house again. Maybe she knew more. She'd said she had lived here long enough to know a few things about the history of the house, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to ask. When I knocked on her door, she answered almost immediately, her thin, white hair pulled back into a bun, her glasses perched low on her nose. "Back again, I see," she said, her voice low but not unkind. "I need to ask you about something," I said, trying to sound casual, though my hands were shaking. "The house. The one on Rosewood Street. You mentioned a journal last time?" She stared at me, her sharp eyes narrowing for a moment. Then she stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. "Come in then," she said. "But be careful, child. Some things are better left forgotten." I followed her into the dimly lit living room, the air thick with the scent of old furniture and dried flowers. She gestured for me to sit, then took a seat herself, folding her hands in her lap. "You want to know about Dr. Whitley, don't you?" she asked, her voice suddenly softer. I nodded, unable to speak at first. I didn't want to sound desperate, but I was. I needed answers. She sighed deeply. "You're not the first to ask. That house, it's never truly been empty. There's always someone who thinks they can handle the darkness inside. But they always end up leaving, some faster than others. That house, it has a way of pulling people in, of convincing them that they're safe. And then it does its work." She fell silent for a moment, as if recalling something painful. "Dr. Whitley was obsessed with the occult, you know. He wasn't just studying it, he was trying to control it. He believed there was a doorway to another world in that house, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin. He wasn't the first to try to open that door, but he was the one who came the closest. That's why he vanished, he got too close. And whatever he opened, it stayed." The coldness in her voice sent a shiver down my spine. "You mean something came through?" I asked, barely able to choke the words out. She nodded, her expression darkening. "It's been here ever since. Some of the previous tenants tried to fight it, others just disappeared. But that thing, whatever it is, it feeds on fear. And once it senses that you're afraid, it'll never leave you. I stared at her, my mouth dry. So, what happened to the journal? Mrs. Gable looked down at her hands, as if contemplating whether she should say more. I don't know, she whispered. I've heard that it's hidden in the house somewhere, but no one has ever found it. Some say it was destroyed, others say it's been kept safe, waiting for the next person who's curious enough to search for it. But be warned, child, curiosity is the thing that will get you in the end. I wanted to ask more, to beg her for more details, but something in her eyes stopped me. There was fear there, real fear. And for the first time, I realized that she wasn't just warning me out of kindness. She was warning me because she knew exactly what I was up against. I left her house soon after, my mind spinning with everything I'd just heard. The pieces were starting to fit together. Dr. Whitley had opened something that shouldn't have been opened. And now, whatever it was getting closer. When I returned to my own house, the air felt heavier. The smell that had plagued the house for days seemed to be worse, more pungent. And the whispering sound was back, louder this time. It was coming from the walls again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a low growl, as though something was trying to break through. I stood still in the middle of the living room, my breath shallow, waiting for the sound to stop. It didn't. It only grew louder. Then something changed. The growl stopped, replaced by a soft scratching sound. At first I thought it was just a rodent, maybe a rat or squirrel in the walls. But as the scratching grew louder and more frantic, my heart began to race. It sounded wrong, unnatural. I rushed to the basement door, feeling an overwhelming compulsion to go down there. I didn't want to. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't stop myself. The moment I stepped onto the stairs, I heard it again, this time right behind me. The faintest sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. I kept descending, each step feeling like it was dragging me further into the dark. As I reached the bottom, I froze. The basement was colder than I remembered, and the scratching noise was louder, more distinct now. But that wasn't what froze me in place. No, it was the shadows. They weren't normal shadows. They twisted and shifted, moving in ways that shadows shouldn't. And in the far corner of the room, I saw something. A figure, barely visible, but standing completely still. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel its presence. The air was thick with a malevolent energy. Whatever Dr. Whitley had unleashed, it was here waiting, and it knew I was there. The room seemed to pulse with cold, a thick, suffocating chill that wrapped itself around me like an invisible hand. My heart was racing, every beat hammering in my chest as I stood frozen in the basement, staring at the dark corner where I felt the presence watching me. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there, just beyond the edge of my vision. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my feet wouldn't move, and my throat was tight, as though something was stopping me from making a sound. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the corner. Nothing moved. No sound. Just the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in a room with something that shouldn't be there. The scratching noise from the walls had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But it was the silence of something waiting, something patient, something that knew its time was near. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I whirled around, expecting to see a figure, a shadow, something, anything. But there was nothing. The basement was empty, save for the forgotten remnants of old furniture and boxes. The shadows in the corner still clung to the space, but now they seemed darker, thicker. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hand fumbled for the stairs, my legs shaky as if I might collapse any moment. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The sensation of eyes on me, unseen but unmistakably there, was unbearable. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from the house as possible. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something in me was drawn to it, to the mystery, to the curse that clung to the walls of this place, to whatever had been awakened by Dr. Whitley. I forced myself to climb back up the stairs, one hand gripping the banister for support, my feet moving faster now. As I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The house was quiet once more, but it was a silence that felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't reassuring. It was hollow. I leaned against the door for a moment, trying to gather myself, but every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to never look back. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. I needed answers. And so I started my search. The journal. I had to find the journal. Dr. Whitley's journal. Mrs. Gable had said it was hidden somewhere in the house, waiting for someone to discover it. I didn't know where to start, but the desperation was burning inside me. If there was a way to stop this, to understand what was happening, the journal was the key. I spent the next few hours combing through the house, searching every room, every drawer, every closet. The place was a maze of old furniture and dusty corners, but there had to be something hidden here. There had to be something that would explain all of this, the strange noises, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched. As I made my way through the upstairs hallway, I noticed something that I hadn't before, a small door at the end of the hall. It was partially obscured by a faded tapestry, but I could make out the outline of the door frame. It looked different from the others. Smaller. More hidden. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it. The door creaked open with the slightest push, revealing a narrow staircase that led into what appeared to be the attic. The air that greeted me was thick with dust, but it wasn't just that. It was colder than the rest of the house, as if it had been sealed off for years. I didn't want to go up there, but I had no choice. The journal had to be there. It had to be. The steps creaked under my weight as I ascended, the darkness in the attic almost suffocating. I fumbled for the light switch, and when the dim bulb flickered on, I was met with rows of old boxes and discarded furniture. But it was what lay in the far corner that caught my attention. A large wooden chest, old and weathered, sat there like it was waiting for me. The air around it seemed heavier, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows. But I couldn't be sure. My nerves were fraying at the edges, and I was starting to doubt my own senses. I approached the chest slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the latch. It clicked open with a sickening sound, the creaking of the wood too loud in the silence of the attic. Inside, stacked neatly on top of old clothes and papers, was a leather-bound book. The journal. I grabbed it without hesitation, my fingers brushing against the worn cover. As soon as I touched it, I felt a cold surge run through me, a chill that went deeper than the air around me. It wasn't just the temperature. It was as though something had awakened within the pages. I didn't open it right away. Part of me knew that once I did, there would be no turning back. But my curiosity overpowered my fear, and I slowly cracked it open. The first pages were filled with notes about rituals. Rituals designed to open a door to another world, to summon something from beyond. The language was old, almost archaic, but it was clear enough. And then I found it, the passage about the door. The one Dr. Whitley had tried to open. And there it was, written in bold, frantic handwriting. I've done it. The door is open. But I fear what has crossed over. It is not what I expected. It is something worse. My breath caught in my throat as I turned the page. The next words were smeared with ink as if they had been written in haste. It's here. It's watching. It knows I am afraid. A cold draft swept through the attic, and I could feel it against my skin, crawling up my spine. I looked around, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. I wasn't alone. I could feel it again, the presence, the thing watching. The thing that Dr. Whitley had brought here. And it was getting closer. I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. I needed to leave. I had to get out. But as I turned to run, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping me inside. The shadows around me shifted. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl from the far corner. It was here. And there was no escape. I froze. My feet were glued to the floor, every muscle in my body tensed as if preparing for something inevitable. The sound, that guttural growl, reverberated through the attic, shaking the walls and making my bones ache with a cold dread. It wasn't an animal's growl. No, it was something worse. Something inhuman. The air thickened, heavier than before, pressing down on me with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for far too long. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. My only hope was that whatever it was, whatever had followed me into this attic, didn't know I was here. But I could feel its presence, its attention on me, like an invisible hand slowly tightening around my throat. The growl came again, closer this time. My heart raced as I looked toward the far corner, where the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe as if alive. I could make out shapes now, forms that were too dark, too formless to be anything real. They twisted and blurred, their edges shifting like smoke. They didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape before whatever it was in that corner found me. But the door, my only escape, was shut, and I had no idea how to open it. I turned around, searching the attic for anything that could help, anything that could be my salvation. But the room was silent now, oppressive in its stillness, like a trap closing around me. The shadows in the corner were still moving, though. I could see them now clearer than ever. tendrils of darkness stretching out like fingers inching toward me. I stepped back, my hand groping for anything that could give me an advantage, but the only thing I found was the journal, still clutched tightly in my hands. I opened it again, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages, desperate for any clue, any shred of hope. The words blurred before my eyes, the ink smeared as I turned the pages too quickly. Then I found it, a passage near the back of the journal. It was written hastily, as if Dr. Whitley had been trying to finish it in a panic. I have seen it, the thing I have unleashed. It is not of this world. It speaks to me in whispers, promises of power. But I know better now. It is not a gift. It is a curse. I couldn't read any more. My mind couldn't process it. All I could think about was the darkness creeping closer, the air growing colder with every passing second. I glanced up and my blood ran cold. The shadows were no longer in the corner. They were right in front of me now, swirling and forming into something solid, something tangible. And in that mass of darkness I saw it. It wasn't a face, not exactly. It was more like a shifting mass of features, too many eyes, too many mouths, all constantly changing, never resting on any one form. It was like staring into an abyss that mirrored your worst fears, your deepest insecurities. And it was looking at me, watching me. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, trapped by a paralyzing fear. The thing seemed to sense my terror, feeding off it, its tendrils of shadow growing longer, reaching toward me like the claws of a predator. My legs shook, but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. Then it spoke. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, each one colder than the last. "I've been waiting for you." I didn't want to, but I felt my feet moving as if they had a mind of their own, dragging me forward. My body was no longer my own, and I couldn't fight it. I was being pulled toward the thing, its black tendrils reaching for me, wrapping around my legs, my arms pulling me closer. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to scream, but nothing came out. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. And then everything went silent. I opened my eyes again, and the thing was gone. The room was empty. The air was still and cold, but there was no shadow, no growl, no presence. For a moment I thought I had imagined it, that I had been hallucinating, caught in the grip of fear. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound like something tapping against the attic floor. It was soft at first, almost unnoticeable, but it grew louder with each passing second. And then I felt it. Something was behind me. I turned around, and there, in the darkness, I saw the outline of a figure. A person? No, not a person. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form stretching unnaturally. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, glowing faintly like 2 pinpricks of light. And its mouth, oh God, its mouth, was wide, too wide, split open into a grin that didn't belong on a human face. It moved toward me, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring my fear. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my body freeze, unable to move, unable to fight. And then it spoke, its voice like the sound of scraping metal, like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "Now you're mine." With a final, bone-chilling scream, I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor, my heart racing as I scrambled toward the attic door. The figure's footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder, faster, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to get out. I reached the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, my hands slipping off the cold metal. The thing was close now, so close I could hear its breath, a ragged, labored sound. I pulled again, harder this time, and the door creaked open just enough for me to slip through. I didn't stop running, didn't look back, not even when I heard the sound of heavy footsteps following me down the stairs, pounding in the darkness. The house wasn't empty. It never had been. And now it wasn't letting me go. I didn't stop running. My feet flew over the creaky floorboards of the staircase, each step making a sound like a scream, a warning to anyone who might still be asleep. But no one was here. No one would save me. The house was empty, just like the feeling that clung to my skin, suffocating me with every breath I took. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and foreboding. The dim light from the single bulb in the ceiling flickered, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when whatever had been chasing me was so close. I could hear its footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate, and so impossibly fast for something that wasn't quite human. I rushed toward the front door, my hands fumbling at the knob, heart racing, eyes wide with terror. The door wouldn't open. It was stuck as if it had been welded shut. I yanked at it, desperately, pounding on the wood with my fists, but it wouldn't budge. My breath quickened, panic clawing at my chest. "Come on," I muttered to myself, almost pleading. Please let me out. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel the air around me grow colder, as if the temperature was dropping with each passing second. A sudden gust of wind from nowhere sent a shiver up my spine, and I swore I could hear a low, guttural growl in the distance. It was the thing, I was sure of it. I turned away from the door, desperate for any escape, and spotted the small window beside it. Without thinking, I threw myself toward it. I didn't care about the pane or the glass. Anything to get out, anything to escape the nightmare that had me trapped here. I gripped the window frame and pulled, but it was locked. Of course it was locked. I had no choice but to smash the window, and that's exactly what I did. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, splintering into 1,000 shards that scattered across the floor. I ignored the cuts that opened on my skin, ignored the blood that trickled down my arms. The only thing that mattered was escaping. With my heart pounding in my chest, I climbed through the jagged opening, forcing myself out of the window and into the cold night air. I tumbled to the ground, my legs giving out beneath me, but I didn't care. I picked myself up and kept running. I couldn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing I could do was run as fast as my legs could carry me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that house. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something following. Every breath I took felt wrong, every step more laborious than the last. The darkness seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of me, consuming everything around me. The wind howled through the trees, the sound like a mournful scream in the distance. And that smell, sickly sweet like decay and rot, was back, hanging in the air like a heavy shroud. I wanted to throw up, to cough up the poison in my lungs, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, too faint to be real, but it was there. A whisper carried on the wind, a voice that called my name. Sarah? I stopped dead in my tracks. My blood ran cold. I knew that voice. I couldn't mistake it. It was mine. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, expecting the thing to be standing there, waiting for me to make my mistake. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive, endless darkness, stretching out around me like the mouth of some giant beast waiting to devour me. I took a step back, trembling. I had to get back to town. I had to find help. But the voice came again, louder this time. And it wasn't my name it was calling anymore. Come back, it hissed. It's not over. It will never be over. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The darkness pressed in around me, a suffocating weight that crushed my chest, and I ran again, ignoring the scream that echoed behind me. I didn't know how long I ran. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, illuminating the path ahead of me, but I couldn't escape. The house had followed me. The thing had followed me. No matter where I went, it was always just behind me, just out of sight. Eventually, I found myself on a road, a desolate stretch of asphalt that led into the outskirts of town. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, in the distance, I saw the lights of a car coming toward me. Relief surged through me. I waved my arms frantically, yelling for help, desperate to reach the safety of the vehicle. The car slowed, coming to a stop just a few feet away. The door opened, and a man stepped out, his face pale in the headlights. "What the hell are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. "I need help," I gasped, stumbling toward him. "There's something in that house. I need you to." But before I could finish, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The thing was here. It had found me. I turned, and there it was. The darkness stretching out like a blanket, covering the road, blotting out the stars. The man beside me screamed, but it was too late. I felt its icy breath on my neck, and I knew then that there was no escaping it. No way to outrun it. It was inevitable. And just like that, the world went black. I woke up with a gasp, the taste of dirt and cold air lingering on my tongue. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or why I felt so wrong. The world around me was still dark, but not the empty, suffocating blackness that had consumed me moments before. No, this darkness felt different, closer, pressing in on me from all sides. It was like being trapped in a dream you can't wake up from. I blinked, trying to clear my mind, trying to figure out what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the road, the car, the man. But now I was lying on cold, hard ground, my hands pressed against something rough and uneven. I sat up quickly, my head spinning. Where was I? I glanced around, but it didn't take long to realize I was back in the same place. The house. I could see its outline in the distance, rising up like a monstrous figure against the dark sky. Its windows were dark, lifeless, but I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was watching me, waiting for me to come back inside. No, I couldn't go back in there. I'd escaped, hadn't I? I had run. I had. But then the voice came again. Soft at first, like a whisper in the wind, but then louder, more insistent. Come back, it called, come back to me. I froze. It was the same voice. The same cursed voice I had heard before. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run as far away from this place as I could, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the ground. Please, I whispered, more to myself than to anything else. Please, no more. But the voice only grew louder, closer. You belong here, it hissed, the words curling around me like a noose. This is your home now. I shook my head, forcing myself to stand. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever was controlling this place drag me back inside. I had to leave. But before I could take a step, I heard something else. A soft thud. The sound of something, or someone moving behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Nothing but the endless darkness and the creeping sensation of being watched. The thud came again, followed by another, and then a third. Closer this time. Something was out there. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the footsteps behind me now, echoing through the silence, growing louder with every passing second. It was chasing me. Whatever it was chasing me again. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I wouldn't survive the encounter. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing with an eerie light, as if it were alive, breathing, calling to me. But I didn't stop. I had to get away. I pushed myself harder, faster, until my legs screamed for mercy. The thudding of footsteps was deafening now, right on my heels. My lungs were burning, my body screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. Not when I knew that if I did, it would be the end. The road was just ahead. The car. The man. I had to make it to the road. I had to find safety. But then, just as I reached the end of the yard, I felt something cold brush against my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty space behind me. I froze, my body locked in place. And then I heard it. The voice, soft and cruel. Leaving so soon? I turned. And there, standing at the edge of the yard, was the figure. It was just a shadow at first, a dark silhouette against the dim light of the house. But as I looked closer, I saw it more clearly. The figure was tall, thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. It was wearing a long, tattered coat, its edges trailing on the ground like something from another time. The air around it seemed colder, darker, as if it were absorbing all the light and warmth from the world. It smiled. A terrible, twisted smile that made my blood run cold. Come back, it said again, its voice no longer a whisper, but a command. You have no choice. You belong here. You always have. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing was moving now, its feet gliding over the ground as if it didn't touch the earth at all. No, I gasped, shaking my head. No, please stay away. But it didn't stop. It kept coming. I turned and ran, faster than before, my feet flying over the ground, my mind blank with fear. The thing's voice followed me, the words echoing in my head, sinking into my bones. You can't run forever. You'll come back to me. You always do. And that was when I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, wrap around my wrist, pulling me back. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but it held tight. I couldn't break free. And then, with a sudden jerk, the darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I heard was the voice, laughing as it dragged me back into the house. But this time I wouldn't escape. Not ever again. I woke up in darkness again, but this time the air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if something was pressing down on my chest, holding me in place. My eyes flickered open, but there was nothing to see, just blackness stretching on forever. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy as if it had been anchored to the ground. I couldn't breathe. I gasped, my lungs desperate for air, but nothing came. I wasn't in my body anymore, it felt like. I wasn't in control of anything. My mind screamed, but I couldn't make a sound. There was only silence, the kind of silence that was so complete it felt unnatural. The weight pressing on me increased, and I began to feel like I was sinking into the ground, being absorbed by the very earth itself. Then, suddenly, I felt the cold. It started at my feet, creeping up like icy fingers running along my skin, until it reached my chest, my neck, wrapping around my throat. I gasped again, trying to force air into my lungs, but it was no use. The cold was too much, and I could feel myself suffocating under its grasp. The air was thick with the scent of something rotten, like old mold and decay. The smell was so overwhelming that it made me gag, my stomach twisting in protest. I tried to push against the floor beneath me, but it felt like my hands were sinking into the wood, like the very room was swallowing me whole. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound, like something was moving just out of sight. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. The sound of something coming closer. Something breathing. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The air felt colder now, and the rustling grew louder, closer. I could feel it surrounding me, pressing in on me from all sides. Whatever it was near, and it was getting closer with every passing second. And then, the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, each one reverberating in the silence, like the echo of someone walking through a hall. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. The footsteps stopped right next to me. I could feel the cold presence of whatever it was standing there, just inches from my face. I tried to open my eyes, but the darkness was too thick, like something was holding them shut. And then I heard the whisper. It was faint, like a breath on my ear, but the words were unmistakable. "Welcome home." I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. The voice was low, guttural, and impossibly old, like it came from somewhere deep within the earth. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but somehow I knew it. I knew it was the same voice that had haunted me since the moment I stepped foot in this house. The footsteps began again, moving slowly, deliberately, until I could feel the weight of the presence drifting away from me. I didn't dare open my eyes. I was too terrified, too afraid to see whatever it was that was watching me. But then, just as I thought the thing had gone, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold. So cold. I screamed, but no sound came out. The hand tightened its grip, and I could feel my body being dragged, pulled through the darkness. I tried to fight back, but it was no use. The grip was too strong, too unyielding. I was being pulled towards the center of the room, or was it the center of the house? Everything felt distorted now, like the very structure of the house was shifting, changing, warping around me. And then I was standing. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I was standing in front of something. It was a door. The door wasn't like any door I had ever seen before. It was old, wooden, covered in dark carvings that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. The air around it felt raw. It was cold, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the energy, the sheer malevolent force that radiated from the door. I could feel it deep in my bones. The door wasn't meant to be opened. Not by anyone. The presence behind me grew stronger, its grip tightening on my shoulder as I stood there, staring at the door. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was on the other side. But something inside me, something dark, something twisted, urged me forward. The whispers in my ears grew louder, more insistent. I had to open it. I had no choice. Slowly I reached for the handle. The cold burned my skin, seeping through the cracks in my fingers, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I twisted the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside was nothing but darkness. But not the same darkness I had been in before. This darkness felt alive, like it was waiting for something. Something or someone. And then I heard it. A low growl, like the sound of something moving in the shadows just beyond my reach. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the floor was made of molasses, thick and sticky, holding me in place. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the presence behind me, waiting, urging me forward. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, something emerged from the darkness. It was a shape, a form shifting and twisting in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it. A presence, an entity, ancient and hungry. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, gleamed in the darkness like 2 points of fire. It was watching me. And then, in a voice that made my blood run cold, it spoke. "Come closer." The door slammed shut behind me, and that's when I realized there was no escape. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the pitch-black room. It felt like an eternity, like I had been caught in some kind of inescapable loop. The air had grown heavier, thicker, pressing down on me from all sides. The cold was unbearable, sharp, like needles scraping against my skin. I could feel it now, the entity, or whatever it was, moving around me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. its eyes watching me from the shadows. It was close, so close that I could hear the soft rustle of movement, the faintest exhale, like the thing was breathing right behind me. I tried to turn to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the house itself had claimed me, holding me captive in its grip. The walls felt alive, pulsating, shifting beneath my feet. I could hear the house groaning, creaking, like it was aware of my every move, every thought. The darkness pressed in, and the smell, there was a smell now, a rancid, nauseating odor that made my stomach churn. It was the same smell I had noticed before, but stronger now, more intense. It was coming from the corners of the room, from the walls, from everywhere. I tried to breathe, tried to calm myself, but panic clawed at my chest. The whispers began again, this time louder, more frantic. They were everywhere, inside my head, in my ears, all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the urgency, the desperation behind them. Get out, leave, before it's too late. I couldn't understand it. I didn't know what it was telling me. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out. I had to leave this place, this house, before whatever was lurking in the shadows consumed me. I forced myself to move, to take a step. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unyielding, but I managed to inch forward. The floor beneath me creaked in protest, the old wood groaning under my weight. I could feel the house tightening its grip around me, its walls closing in, trying to keep me trapped. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if the house itself was warning me, urging me to stay. But I couldn't. I had to escape. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. I fumbled with it, my fingers slipping, but eventually I managed to turn it. The door creaked open, and I was met with the familiar sight of the hallway, the same hallway I had walked down countless times before. But something was different. The air felt raw. It was colder, more suffocating. The walls seemed to press in on me, closing in from all sides. I stepped into the hallway, and that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking behind me. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty hallway stretching out before me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. I could feel them now, the vibrations of each step echoing through the floor, the walls, the very air around me. I tried to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was being held in place, trapped in this never-ending nightmare. The footsteps were right behind me now, too close. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck, cold and rancid. I spun around again, but this time I saw it. The thing. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form twisted and distorted. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes, they were gleaming, glowing like twin orbs of fire. Its skin was pale, sickly, stretched tight over its bones, and its fingers, long, unnaturally long, reached out toward me. I screamed, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled, as if the very air had been sucked from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The thing was coming for me, its fingers reaching for me, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque grin. Leave, it whispered, its voice like a rasp, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against the ground. Leave or stay forever? I tried to run, tried to break free, but the house held me fast. The walls seemed to shift, trapping me in place, trapping me with it. The thing's fingers brushed against my skin, cold and clammy, and I felt a surge of pure, unrelenting terror. It was too late. There was no escaping. I collapsed to my knees, my hands trembling as I pressed them to my face. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but there was no escape. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the thing vanished. The footsteps stopped. The house grew quiet again, eerily so, as if nothing had happened. I stood there in the silence, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. But I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't over. It wasn't gone. I could feel it, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. It was the house. The house was alive, and it wanted me to stay. And it would never let me go. I had to leave. No. But as I turned to run, a voice, quiet, almost gentle, whispered in my ear, "You can never leave." And I knew without a doubt that it was true. I don't know how I managed to move, but somehow I forced my legs to take the first step. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat like a drum, loud enough to drown out the silence of the house. The air was thick, suffocating, and it felt as though the very walls were leaning in, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stumbled down the hallway, my eyes flicking between the shadows, my body trembling uncontrollably. I knew it was close, I could feel it. The house, whatever it was closing in on me. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the wood groaning as though it was alive, as if the house itself was awake, aware, and trying to stop me from leaving. The door. I had to reach the door. But when I turned the corner, I froze. The door to the outside wasn't where it should have been. It wasn't at the end of the hallway anymore. The hallway was longer now, stretching endlessly, twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't the house I knew. It couldn't be. The walls had shifted, the layout was wrong. The door that had been just a few feet away now seemed miles out of reach. The whispers started again. Low at first, almost inaudible, but then they grew louder, more insistent. A cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, overlapping, each one calling my name in a different tone, a different pitch. Leave, you're not welcome here. Stay, forever, the house needs you. Please, help me, it's too late. My mind raced, panic surging through me, drowning out everything else. I stumbled forward, desperate to reach the door, but the hallway seemed to stretch further with every step. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the house pulsing with a dark, suffocating energy. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind hit me from behind, making me spin around. The house groaned, the walls shuddering as if in pain. I saw it then, standing at the end of the hallway, a shadowy figure. The thing. It was back. Its eyes glowed like embers in the dark, burning with an unnatural, malevolent light. Its shape was unclear, but its presence was undeniable. It was there, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth felt dry, my throat tight. I couldn't breathe. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, unable to stop myself. The figure moved toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. Each step it took sent waves of cold through the air, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The floorboards creaked under its weight, each sound like a hammer strike in the silence. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out. But my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. And then it spoke. You should have left when you had the chance, it hissed, its voice a rasping, guttural sound. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I felt a chill deep in my bones, as if the very essence of my being was being drained away. The house was feeding on me, on my fear. I could feel it pulling at me, pulling me toward the figure, toward the darkness. It reached out a hand, long bony fingers stretching toward me. I could see the skin was cracked, decayed, like something that had been dead for a long time. I screamed then, my voice breaking through the silence. I pushed myself backward, my hands scrambling against the floor, trying to escape. But the thing was too fast. It grabbed my arm, its grip icy like death itself. You belong to this house now, it whispered, its breath foul like rotting flesh. You will never leave. You will never be free. Tears filled my eyes, and I closed my mind off from the terror, trying to block out the horror in front of me. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could hear was the thudding of my own heartbeat, the desperate pounding of my chest, the clanging of my ribs as though they might burst from the pressure. With one last burst of energy, I pushed against the floor, using every ounce of strength I had left. I broke free from its grasp, scrambling to my feet. I didn't know how, but I found myself running, my feet pounding against the floor, my body fueled by pure, raw fear. I ran through the hallway, through the endless maze of twisting corridors, each turn a new nightmare, each door a new obstacle. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out. The house wanted me, but I wouldn't let it have me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the door. The real door this time. The one that led outside. I flung it open, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. I stepped out onto the porch, the darkness of the yard stretching out before me, the wind biting at my skin. But as I turned to look at the house one last time, I saw it. Something moved behind the window, something large, something that shouldn't be there. The thing was still inside, waiting. And I realized then, with a terrible certainty, that the house hadn't let me go. It had only let me leave. For now. I ran into the night, the sound of footsteps chasing me, echoing in my ears. The house might have let me out, but I knew deep down that it would never truly release me. It would never stop hunting me. And as I ran, I could still hear the whispers, still feel the cold, still hear that one voice telling me over and over again, "You can never leave." And I didn't know how, but I knew it was true. I ran for what felt like miles, my legs burning, my lungs gasping for air. The cold night clung to me, a blanket of darkness that seemed to stretch on endlessly, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to keep moving, to keep running as if the very act of escape would somehow break the connection, sever the invisible thread that bound me to that place. But the more I ran, the more I could feel it, like an echo, a pull from somewhere deep within, something I couldn't explain. A weight in the air, a pressure on my chest that wouldn't relent no matter how fast my feet carried me. It wasn't just the house. It was something else. Something older. Something watching. I found myself in the center of the town, the quiet streets eerily still. There were no cars, no lights in the windows, nothing but the distant sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then a strange thought crept into my mind as if whispered from the darkness itself. You're still here. I shook my head, willing myself to ignore it. The house was gone, right? I had left it behind, stepped out of its shadow. I was free. But when I looked around, something felt wrong. The town was too quiet, too empty. The streetlights flickered, casting odd shadows on the pavement, shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally, like they were alive. My fingers tingled with an icy sensation as I walked down the road, the cold air biting at my skin. I turned down the street where my apartment had been. The building stood in the distance, shrouded in mist. It had only been a few hours since I'd left, but it felt as though time itself had bent, stretched, and altered somehow. The place I had called home, well, the place I had been living, was now nothing more than a distant memory, but it was still there. The apartment building just as I'd left it. But I didn't want to go back. I couldn't go back. I picked up my pace, walking faster now, my mind a jumble of thoughts. But then my breath caught in my throat. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Just a flicker of motion, too quick to catch, but enough to make my heart race. I turned sharply to look, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty street. But the feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance, suffocating, crawling up my spine. My skin prickled, and I could hear the distant sound of footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, but growing louder. Closer. I spun around, but again, nothing. No one. The street was deserted as it had been since I arrived. I wasn't alone. The feeling was undeniable. I quickened my pace, my breath shallow, but no matter how fast I walked, the footsteps seemed to match my rhythm, always a few paces behind. They were real. I wasn't imagining it. Then, out of nowhere, a low, guttural sound broke the silence. A scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. A sound that was unmistakably close. My heart skipped a beat. I felt a cold gust of wind swirl around me, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. My stomach turned. The house wasn't just a building, it was alive. Its presence was still lingering, wrapping around me like chains, pulling me back into its grasp. I broke into a run. My legs burned, my mind raced. The footsteps were behind me now, clear, loud, and relentless, their pace matching mine exactly, as though someone was keeping up, just inches away. My feet carried me to the park near the town's center. I didn't know why, but something in me told me I had to stop here, that I had to face whatever was chasing me. I slowed, taking a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, getting louder. They were almost on top of me. And then I saw it, just beyond the trees. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the shadows, watching me. The faint glow of its eyes pierced through the darkness. The same eyes I had seen in the house. The thing from the house. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I stood frozen, paralyzed with fear. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. Each step it took made the ground tremble beneath me. I could feel the earth shifting, like something old, ancient, was waking beneath my feet. It came closer, its eyes never leaving mine. And then it spoke. "You can't run from me," it said, its voice hollow, distant. The words were like a chill wind, cutting through me, draining the strength from my body. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to do anything to break free from this nightmare. But my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figure reached out a hand. Its fingers were long, sharp, like talons, and they hovered just inches from my face. "You belong to this place now," it said, its breath cold against my skin. "This town, this house, it's all the same. You will never leave. You will never be free." And then the ground beneath me shifted again, and the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. I woke up in my apartment. The morning sunlight poured through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. The house, the figure, the footsteps. but when I glanced around, my heart stopped. The journal was there on the table. The one I had found in the house, the one filled with the dark history of the place. And on its pages, the words seemed to shimmer and shift as though alive. Asterisk, you will always return. Asterisk. I took a deep breath, the weight of those words sinking in. It was over. But it wasn't really over. It would never be over. The house had let me go, but only for now. I looked out the window toward the edge of the town where the house still stood, and I knew deep down that it would wait. For the next person. Or for me. Story 3. I had always thought moving to a new town would be the fresh start I needed. After everything that happened, my divorce, the endless hours at the office, the feeling of my life stuck in a loop, I was desperate for a change. So, when the apartment ad popped up on my screen, promising a cozy, affordable place in a quiet neighborhood, it seemed like fate. I didn't care much about the house's age or its quirks. I just needed somewhere to call my own. The house was old, sure, something you might expect to find in a town that had barely changed in decades. It creaked and groaned with every shift in the wind, the wooden floors so worn that even walking softly could set them off. But the charm of it was undeniable. The wood trim, the creaky stairs, the tiny yard with overgrown hedges, it was a place that whispered of stories and history, of things that had come before me. I could feel it in the air, the weight of time pressing down. When I first moved in, I felt an odd comfort in the stillness of the place. It was quiet, save for the distant sounds of cars rolling by on the main road. I liked that. I liked the silence, the way the house seemed to wrap around me, providing a strange sense of protection. The neighborhood was small and peaceful, with old houses that seemed to be holding their breath, just like mine. But there were things about the house that I couldn't ignore, not at first anyway. The floorboards. They weren't the soft, pleasant creaks you expect from a house this old. They were sharp, loud, almost deliberate, as though the house was trying to tell me something. I brushed it off. Old houses made noises. It was probably just the wood expanding and contracting in the cold nights. Then there was the smell. At first, it was faint, something earthy like damp leaves or old furniture, mixed with a slightly metallic tang that I couldn't place. I opened the windows, aired out the place, but it never fully went away. Every so often it would fade for a while, but it always returned like it was trapped inside the walls. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just an old house. The kind of place that had absorbed decades of memories, good and bad. But there was something about it that felt off. Still, I carried on with my days. I set up the furniture, unpacked my boxes, and started a routine. It felt normal enough. Wake up, go to work, come home, make dinner, and settle in for the night. I told myself I was getting used to the sounds, the smells, the quirks of the house. It was during one of these routines, just a few days after I'd moved in, that I met my neighbor, Mrs. Carter. She lived in the house next door, a faded green cottage with a garden that always looked like it had been neglected for years. We spoke briefly one afternoon when I was bringing in my groceries. She smiled warmly, though her eyes were always darting around as if she were listening for something. "You're the new tenant," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've got the old Hawthorne place, haven't you?" I nodded, unsure of what she meant by old. The house had been on the market for years, and I had assumed I was the first to rent it in a long time. "Yes, I just moved in," I said, feeling a little awkward. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. She leaned in a bit as if sharing a secret. "Well, just so you know, that house has a reputation." I raised an eyebrow, my curiosity piqued. "Reputation?" "Oh, it's nothing to worry about. Just stories people tell." She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "I'm sure it's all nonsense. But the people who lived there before you, well, they didn't last long. One of them ran out of there in the middle of the night, babbling about curses. Others heard strange noises, footsteps when no one was around. It's probably just the house settling, but people talk. You know how it is." I couldn't tell if she was serious or just trying to make conversation. Either way, I nodded politely and excused myself. The conversation lingered in the back of my mind, but I pushed it aside. It was just an old woman's story. She was probably lonely, looking for someone to talk to. But as the days passed, something started to shift in me. It was the little things at first. The way the air grew colder some nights, even when the heat was on full blast. The occasional thud from the walls, like something heavy had been dropped in the attic. Sometimes I'd be in bed, the house completely silent, and I'd hear a soft creaking sound like someone walking around. I'd get up, half expecting to find a busted pipe or an animal in the walls. But nothing. Just the emptiness of an old house. It wasn't until the third night that I noticed something truly unsettling. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard footsteps. Clear, deliberate footsteps. They echoed through the house as if someone was pacing back and forth just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear. They stopped. And then right outside my door, the floor creaked. Slowly. As if someone was leaning against it, pressing their weight into the wood. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling, but the footsteps didn't return. The house was quiet again. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, the sound of the wind causing things to shift. But that didn't explain the feeling in the air, the heaviness, the pressure. I spent the rest of the night with the covers pulled tight around me, trying to ignore the chill creeping into the room. The next day, I chalked it up to nerves, the natural anxiety of adjusting to a new place. But that night, the footsteps returned. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination getting the best of me. I had been through a lot recently, the divorce, the move, the new job. It made sense that I was on edge. But that didn't stop the cold feeling that had settled in my chest. I went about my day busying myself with unpacking the last few boxes, trying to make the place feel more like home. But even as I did, the house felt more distant, as though it were watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The walls seemed to hum with a quiet, persistent energy. Every room felt heavy, like the air was thick with secrets that I wasn't meant to know. That night, I tried to sleep again. I had placed a chair in front of the door, something to keep my mind from wandering, from imagining things that weren't there. But it wasn't the footsteps that unsettled me this time. It was the smell, the same earthy metallic scent that seemed to have taken hold of the place. It was stronger now, almost suffocating, and no matter how many windows I opened, it didn't dissipate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old house, the musty smell of decades of dust and wood. But as I lay there in the dark, the air grew colder, sharper. The smell grew stronger, like something decaying deep within the walls. I pulled the blanket up over my head, but the cold seeped through, chilling me to the bone. Then the creaking started again. Slowly, methodically, as if someone was walking through the house, deliberately pacing back and forth. I could hear it above me, then to the side, like they were in the next room, right next to the wall. I held my breath, hoping that it was just the house, that the wind had picked up again, making the old beams groan and shift. But it didn't stop. The pacing continued, relentless. I got up, heart pounding in my chest, and quietly made my way to the living room. The floorboards protested under my feet as I walked, their shrill squeaks breaking the silence. I paused at the foot of the stairs, my eyes darting around the dark hallway. Nothing. No movement. The house felt empty as it should have. But then, from upstairs, came a soft, drawn-out whisper. It wasn't a voice, not really, but more of a sound, a low, rasping noise that seemed to call my name. I froze, my blood running cold. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a summons. I turned on the light, my hands shaking, and rushed up the stairs, each step creaking loudly beneath me. The whisper faded before I could reach the top, but it lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to leave. My heart raced as I entered the small bedroom at the end of the hall. Nothing. No sign of anything that could explain the noise. The room was just as it had been when I moved in, empty save for the furniture and a few scattered boxes. But the air felt thick, oppressive. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. On the floor near the corner of the room was a small patch of dust, untouched by time. It was different from the rest of the room. It had been disturbed recently. A trail of footprints, faint but unmistakable, leading toward the closet. I didn't want to follow them. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run away from the house. But something compelled me to approach. Slowly, cautiously, I crossed the room, my feet barely making a sound against the floor. The footprints led right up to the closet door, which stood ajar. I could see the faint outline of something within, something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. I took a deep breath, my pulse hammering in my ears, and reached for the door handle. And then a loud bang echoed through the house. I jumped back, my heart leaping into my throat. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The air grew cold again, a sudden chill that cut through the room like a knife. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the closet. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I heard something. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wooden floor. It was coming from inside the closet. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. The sound grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to get out. Finally, my legs gave way and I stumbled backward, falling onto the floor. I didn't know how long I lay there, but when I finally mustered the courage to stand, the house was silent again. Too silent. The scraping, the whispering, the cold, everything had stopped as suddenly as it had started. But the feeling in the air remained, pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I left the room in a daze, not daring to look back. The stairs creaked under my feet as I hurried down, my mind whirling with confusion and fear. When I reached the living room, I locked the door behind me, the feeling of dread hanging over me like a dark cloud. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go near the closet. I didn't even want to look at the room again. But the footprints, they were still there, etched into the dust on the floor leading to the closet. I swept them away with a rag, but the chill that clung to the room refused to lift. I was starting to feel the weight of the house's history. Mrs. Carter's words echoed in my mind, people who had lived here before, who had heard strange noises, who had run out of the house in terror. I didn't want to believe in curses or ghosts, but the events of the past few nights were harder to ignore. I needed to know more. I had to understand what was happening here, what I had gotten myself into. The house held secrets, and I was determined to uncover them. But as I walked past the closet again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I couldn't help but wonder, what if I wasn't meant to find the answers? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't ignore what was happening. The whispers, the strange occurrences, it all felt like too much to brush off as the house simply settling. There was something darker here, something tied to the very foundation of this place. I needed answers. The first thing I did was ask Mrs. Carter about the house's history. She was the only neighbor who seemed to know anything about it, but I had no idea just how much she might know. I knocked on her door late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. When she answered, I tried to hide the anxiety creeping up on me. Her face softened when she saw me standing there, a hesitant smile forming. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Back again so soon?" I nodded, my voice tight. "I was hoping you could tell me more about this house. I've been having some strange experiences, and I thought maybe you could help." Mrs. Carter's expression changed, a flicker of something like pity or concern flashing across her face. She stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "Sit down," she said softly, motioning to the couch. "You're not the first person to ask. This house has a way of getting under your skin, making you feel like you're not alone." I sat down, but the feeling of unease only deepened. I had expected her to laugh it off or tell me it was all in my head, but she seemed almost too serious about it. She sat down opposite me, her hands folded in her lap. "You've heard the rumors, I'm sure," she began, "about the people who lived here before." I nodded, my heart beating faster. "I heard someone ran out, terrified. They said something about a curse?" Mrs. Carter sighed, leaning back. "The stories go back a long way. The house was built by a man named Charles Vance, a recluse, some say. He was obsessed with the occult, with things most people wouldn't even begin to understand. Some say he found something, opened a door to something dark, and brought it back with him." I shivered at her words, but she continued. "His wife died mysteriously, and after that he became more reclusive. People would hear strange noises from the house, loud banging, chanting, footsteps in the middle of the night. And then, one day he just disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. His house was abandoned for years, and that's when the rumors started." I was barely listening anymore, my mind racing. A man who was obsessed with the occult, and then vanished. It wasn't just the house that was unsettling, it was everything surrounding it. I had to know more. "Do you know where I can find anything about him? Any records? Diaries, maybe?" Mrs. Carter's face grew tight, as if she was reluctant to answer. She hesitated before nodding slowly. "There's something, yes. When the house was abandoned, the previous owners, well, they found a journal tucked away in the attic. I'd forgotten about it until now. It was said to be Vance's. But it was strange, even for someone obsessed with the occult. It said to be cursed, the words inside. People who read it, they don't come out the same." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. A cursed journal. I had to have it. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. Mrs. Carter's eyes studied me for a long moment before she answered. "It's in the attic. If you're sure you want to go there, it's up to you. But be careful. The house has a way of making people lose their minds." I thanked her quickly, already heading toward the door. My heart pounded, a mix of fear and excitement. I had to see that journal. If there was anything in it that could explain what was happening to me, I needed to know. The attic wasn't easy to reach. I had never been up there, and as I climbed the narrow, creaky stairs, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had made this same journey before me. How many had felt the same dread creep up their spine as they entered that dark, forgotten space. The attic door was thick with dust, the handle cold to the touch. It creaked open slowly, revealing a room filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like delicate curtains, and the air was musty, thick with the smell of age and decay. It felt like stepping back in time, into a place where the world outside had forgotten. I began to search through the boxes, my heart racing with anticipation. It felt like the walls were closing in around me, the silence deafening. The only sound was the soft scuffle of my shoes on the wooden floor and my own heavy breathing. And then I found it. Tucked away in a dusty corner, behind a stack of old newspapers, was a small leather-bound book. It was worn, its edges frayed, and the cover was cracked with age. But as soon as I touched it, I felt a cold shiver run through me. It was as though the book had been waiting for me. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded with time. But the words, though difficult to read, were unmistakable. They were written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "The door is open," one of the first entries read. "I can feel it, breathing, waiting. The ritual must be complete. It will come, and when it does, there will be no escape." I couldn't stop reading. The more I turned the pages, the more frantic the entries became. There were drawings, too, strange symbols, circles, and patterns that made no sense. But there was one drawing that stood out among the rest. A dark figure, tall and thin, standing in the doorway with empty eyes staring out. And then, at the very end of the journal, were the final words. "It's here. It's waiting." I closed the journal with shaking hands, the weight of what I had just read sinking in. The air in the attic felt colder now, almost unbearable. The house felt alive, and I could hear the whispers again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. They seemed to be coming from the walls, from the very floor beneath me. I stood up, clutching the journal to my chest, ready to leave. But as I turned to head back toward the stairs, the attic door slammed shut behind me. I froze. There was no sound, no wind, no logical explanation. But the door was shut tight and I was trapped. The air in the attic grew thick, pressing against my chest like some unseen force. I couldn't breathe properly, my every inhale shallow and panicked. I turned back to the door, my hand reaching for the handle, but it was as though the very wood had become one with the frame. It wouldn't budge. I rattled the door, my panic escalating with each failed attempt to open it. The journal still clutched tightly in my hands, the words I had just read swirling in my mind like a storm. "It's waiting, it's here." I took a step back, eyes darting around the attic. There were no windows, just shadows that seemed to swallow the weak light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The entire space felt suffocating, as though something was watching me. I tried to calm myself, but the longer I stood there, the more everything seemed to close in. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, grow taller, darker. The old furniture and forgotten relics suddenly felt less like inanimate objects and more like silent witnesses, their eyes on me even though they had none. Then it happened. The creak. It started low, almost inaudible, but as I turned toward the sound, it grew louder, more pronounced, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the house. Each step felt like it was echoing through my bones. They weren't just in my ears, they were inside me, vibrating through my chest, sending a sickening ripple through my body. I froze, heart hammering. The footsteps continued, but they weren't coming from the floor beneath me or the hallway outside. No, these steps were closer, much closer. And then I heard something else, breathing. It wasn't mine. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own racing heart. But then it grew louder, closer. It was ragged, uneven, like someone, or something, was struggling to breathe. My breath hitched, my blood turning cold. The journal fell from my hands, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor. I didn't know why I moved, but I did. I stepped back toward the farthest corner of the attic, my eyes glued to the door, which still remained firmly shut. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to admit what was happening. But deep down I knew. Whatever was in the house had followed me up here. I turned toward the corner of the room, where the old rotting furniture loomed like forgotten phantoms. My mind scrambled for an explanation, anything that would make sense. But nothing came. There was nothing left to explain the feeling of cold fingers brushing against my neck, the hair rising on the back of my head, the slow realization that the attic wasn't empty. And then I saw it. It wasn't a person, at least not like any person I'd ever seen. It was a shape, tall and impossibly thin, its body seeming to bend and stretch in unnatural ways. Its outline was blurry as though the darkness itself was consuming it. But its eyes, those hollow empty eyes, locked onto mine. They were dark pits, full of something ancient and unholy, and as they stared at me, I felt as though I was being pulled into them, sucked into some void from which there would be no return. My heart slammed in my chest. The breathing grew heavier, deeper, like something that hadn't been able to breathe in ages was finally drawing in its first lungful of air. It was a sound that chilled me to the core. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. And then, it did something that made the blood in my veins freeze. It smiled. The smile stretched impossibly wide, too wide for any human being. It was a grin filled with sharp, jagged teeth, as if it had been carved from something far darker than flesh. My stomach lurched, my legs weak with terror. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there watching me. The air around it seemed to distort, as though the very presence of it was warping reality. I heard its voice then, a low whisper that scraped against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. It wasn't words, not really, but I understood it. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was everywhere inside my head, and yet, it didn't come from the figure. It was a feeling, an emotion, a memory rising from deep within me, a memory I didn't know I had. My hands shook as I reached for the journal again, the only thing that seemed to offer me any sense of control. I fumbled with it, turning the pages frantically, trying to find some answer. The figure took a slow step forward, its form bending and stretching in ways that defied any logic. It was moving closer. "Leave this place," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. "It's too late." And then the air turned frigid, so cold that I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke. I could feel it now. Something was right behind me. Something unseen. Something I couldn't explain. I knew I had to get out. There was no other choice. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the journal anymore. I didn't care about the footsteps or the whispering voice. I just ran, stumbling down the narrow attic steps, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow and ragged. Behind me I could hear it, slow, steady footsteps following me just out of reach. And then the door, thank God, the door to the attic was open. I rushed through it, slamming it shut behind me, but the sound of those footsteps, those relentless, inescapable footsteps, didn't stop. They followed me all the way down the hall, all the way to the front door. But when I reached the front door and threw it open, it wasn't relief I felt. It was dread. The silence outside was worse than any noise. It was too quiet. The air felt wrong. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the house. I didn't even look back. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still hear it. The footsteps, the breathing, the whispers, and the voice. You shouldn't have come back. I never thought I'd go back to that house. After the terror I experienced, the dark presence that followed me, I was sure I'd never see it again. But somehow that wasn't enough to end the nightmare. A week passed and my mind was in turmoil. The weight of what had happened, what I had seen, hung over me like a shadow that I couldn't escape. The darkness that had once been confined to the house now seemed to follow me in fragments. At night, I'd hear faint noises, feel cold spots in my apartment, and wake up in a cold sweat, eyes wide open, heart racing. I tried to dismiss it. I wanted to believe that it was just the stress from the move, the change in my life. But deep down, I knew better. I kept hearing the voice. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear its whisper, like it was right behind me, in my ear. You shouldn't have come back. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was calling me, that it had a claim over me that I couldn't escape. It was like I was tethered to it, even though I was miles away. I had to know what was going on. The journal, the one I had found in the attic, had to hold the answers. I couldn't let it haunt me forever without understanding what I was dealing with. So, I did what I knew I had to do. I went back. It wasn't easy. My heart was already pounding before I even reached the street where the house stood. The neighborhood had a strange emptiness to it now. I remembered the vibrant faces that used to walk these sidewalks, but today, everything seemed muted, subdued. The house itself looked more sinister in the daylight, its broken windows and sagging porch seeming to groan under the weight of its history. I parked my car at the curb, staring at the house. A strange part of me wanted to turn and leave, but another part, the part that needed answers, pushed me forward. I walked up the front steps, every creak of the wooden boards beneath my feet sending shivers down my spine. I was already inside before I realized I had let myself in. The door, which had once been locked when I fled in terror, now stood ajar as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening with every creak of the floorboards beneath me. The smell hit me first, a damp, musty odor that seemed to cling to the walls. I could hear the faint scurrying of something small, perhaps a rat, somewhere deep within the walls. The silence was thick, oppressive. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I headed straight for the attic. It was the only place that made any sense. The journal was there and I had to see it again. My fingers brushed against the banister as I ascended the stairs, the wood splintering slightly under my touch. When I reached the attic, I noticed the door was shut. But this time it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like an invitation. I pushed the door open, expecting the same thick air, the same suffocating presence. But when I stepped inside, I found something different. It was darker than before, but it wasn't just the absence of light. It was the feeling that something had been erased. The furniture was gone. The floor, which had been covered in dust, now looked polished, almost pristine. The shelves that had once held old books and discarded trinkets were empty. It felt like the house had wiped itself clean. Except for one thing. The journal. It lay on the floor, open as though someone had been reading it recently. I approached it cautiously, the air around me growing colder with every step I took. I bent down to pick it up, but as my fingers brushed the yellowed pages, a sound came from behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle. I whipped around, but there was nothing. No one. I quickly opened the journal, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. It was exactly how I remembered it, but now there was something new. A passage had been added, written in a dark, uneven hand. Asterisk, the door is always open. It waits for the ones who are lost, the ones who seek. But beware, for once you step through, you can never leave. The house will claim you as it claimed me. Asterisk. I froze. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same as the journal's original author, the house's original owner. But the warning, the truth, it was clear now. This house wasn't just haunted, it was a trap, a gateway to something far darker than I could have imagined. Whoever had lived here, whoever had tried to unlock its secrets, had ended up trapped inside it. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here, but before I could move, I heard something again. The breathing. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was close, very close. My head snapped to the side, and there, at the far end of the attic, standing in the shadows, was the figure. The same figure I had seen before. But this time it was different. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. Its face, that horrible grin stretching wider than should have been possible, made my blood run cold. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. The force of it nearly knocked me off my feet. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my chest tightening with panic. The air grew even colder, the very fabric of the room vibrating with a malevolent energy. I backed away slowly, trying not to let my fear take over. But as I turned to leave, I felt something grip my ankle. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a thing. It was the house itself. It had come alive. I yanked my leg free, stumbling toward the door, but the figure, now no longer a shadow but a presence, was in front of me. Its form was solidifying, growing more real with each passing second. And then the floor beneath me cracked. The old house groaned like a dying animal. I could feel the walls, the floor, everything shifting, as though the house itself was collapsing into something far deeper than I could understand. I turned and ran, but as I reached the stairs, the darkness surged. The figure was at the top now, its smile wide in its eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, glowing with an unnatural light. I ran faster, not daring to look back. And as I reached the door and threw it open, the voice followed me, one last whisper on the wind. You can't escape me. But when I stepped outside, everything was still. The house stood silently in front of me, like nothing had happened. And yet, I could still hear the breathing. I didn't know what to do next. My legs trembled, my mind raced, and my body felt like it was betraying me as I stumbled away from the house, not daring to look back. The streets were empty, eerily quiet, but the sound of my own breath, ragged and sharp, was the only thing I could hear. But even as I walked away, I could feel it, the presence of the house looming over me, an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. It wasn't gone. It wasn't over. The house had never really let me go. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it, as if the simple act of securing the vehicle could keep whatever was following me at bay. But I knew it wouldn't. I had to leave town. I had to get out of here before whatever force that lived in that house found me again. I started the engine, my hands still trembling, and pulled away from the curb, my eyes glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. The house was still there, standing silent and foreboding in the distance. I drove, not caring where I was going, just needing to get far enough away from that place. The The streets blurred past me, the city giving way to fields and then to wilderness, but no matter how far I went, I could still hear it. The house, its whispers, its breath. Every night, no matter where I was, I could hear it, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Like a memory I couldn't escape, a shadow that clung to me even in the brightest sunlight. I thought about calling someone, telling them what had happened, but who would believe me? Who would listen to a story about a house that wasn't just haunted, but alive? A house that called to you, that wanted you, and that took something with it each time it claimed a new soul. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. Instead, I isolated myself, burying myself in my work, doing whatever I could to push it all to the back of my mind. But no matter what I did, I could never escape it. I could never outrun it. One evening, weeks after I thought I had outrun the nightmare, I was sitting at home trying to relax when I heard something. A knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could be here at this hour? I hadn't been expecting anyone. The knock came again, faint, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. With great reluctance, I got up from the couch and walked toward the door, my footsteps heavy on the floor, each one echoing like a drumbeat in the quiet room. I peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door, my breath shallow and uneven. There, sitting on the doorstep, was a package. A small, unmarked box, wrapped in plain brown paper. My stomach churned as I stared at it. I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't even been expecting anything. So why was this here? I bent down, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. The moment I touched the box, a chill ran up my spine, like an electric current shot through me. My heart skipped a beat. The familiar whispering, that voice, echoed in my mind again. You shouldn't have left. I ripped the package open, not sure what I was expecting, but what I found made my blood run cold. Inside was a small, weathered book. A journal. But it wasn't the same as the one I had found in the house. This one was different. It was new, too new, in fact, to have come from anywhere but here, from this place. It was bound in black leather, the pages still crisp, untouched by age. I opened the first page, and there, written in dark ink, was a single phrase: "Welcome home." I slammed the book shut, my breathing erratic, my head spinning. I knew where this had come from. I knew what it meant. The house was calling me back. It had never let go. It had never stopped following me. I threw the book in the trash, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. I knew that nothing would be enough. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every distant sound made my heart race. I stayed awake, watching the shadows move around me, afraid that I would wake up to find the house standing right next to me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then the knocking started again. Soft, faint at first, then louder, more insistent, coming from all around me. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from inside the walls, from the floors, from the very house itself. I could feel it. The house was alive. It had always been alive. I stood, paralyzed with fear, my mind reeling, and as the knocking continued, something else began to happen. A coldness spread through the room, an icy chill that made my breath freeze in the air. And then, from behind me came the voice. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, I could hear it clearly. Asterisk, you can't run. You can't hide. You'll never escape, asterisk. And then I knew. It wasn't just the house I had been running from. It was something far worse. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a doorway. A portal to something far darker, something that wanted me, that needed me. The knocking stopped and I knew it was time. The house was waiting, and no matter where I went, it would find me. I couldn't fight it anymore. I had to go back. But this time I wouldn't be running. It was almost a relief when I made the decision to go back. I didn't want to feel like a coward anymore, constantly running from something that had already taken hold of me. But as I drove toward the house, the closer I got, the more the reality of what I was doing sank in. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle had begun to fall, turning the world around me into a haze of muted colors. The town seemed quieter now, more desolate. I couldn't help but feel that everything had shifted somehow, like I was walking into a trap that had been waiting for me all along. The house loomed in the distance just as I remembered it, tall, decaying, and unervingly silent. It was as if the very air around it held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The dark windows stared back at me like eyes, empty but somehow knowing. I parked the car at the curb, my body stiff with tension. I had no plan. I had no idea what I was going to do once I was inside. But one thing was clear. I couldn't let whatever was haunting me win. I couldn't let it control me any longer. I stepped out of the car, my shoes making soft splashes in the puddles forming on the ground. The rain was now falling more steadily, the sound of it against the pavement and the trees filling the silence around me. But as I made my way to the house, I felt an unsettling warmth against my skin, like an invisible force was radiating from the building. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering above the knob. The house seemed to be calling me again, drawing me in like a magnet. I could hear the faintest sound of something, footsteps maybe, or just the creak of the house settling. It didn't matter. I had come this far. I wasn't leaving. I pushed the door open, the old hinges groaning in protest. The familiar smell of musty wood and dampness hit me immediately. It was as if the house had been waiting for me, breathing in the same air that I was. The temperature dropped as I stepped inside, a chill that sank into my bones. The shadows in the corner seemed to stretch out, reaching for me, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. Every step I took echoed in the emptiness, a reminder that I was alone here, or was I? I stood still for a moment, listening. The silence pressed in on me from every direction. It felt suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. I knew I couldn't stand around forever. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, why this house had such a hold on me, and why I couldn't escape it. I made my way to the stairs, each step feeling like a weight on my chest. The air grew colder with each floor I climbed, as if the house were trying to push me back, warning me to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't go back now. At the top of the stairs, I paused in front of the door to the room I had once called my own. It looked unchanged, just as it had when I first moved in, empty, still, and cold. I had to go in. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me with a loud thud. The room felt different now, though. It wasn't just the temperature or the shadows, it was something more, something I couldn't name. The walls seemed to pulse, faintly, as if the house itself was alive, breathing. And there, on the bed, lay something I hadn't noticed before. A journal. Not the one I had thrown away, but something new. It was open, lying on the pillow, the pages fluttering slightly as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the bed. The book was thick, bound in dark leather. I reached for it with trembling hands, my fingers brushing the cool surface. When I opened the first page, a chill ran through me. There, in the same handwriting as before, were the words, "It is time." A feeling of dread settled over me, heavy and suffocating. The room seemed to shrink around me, and I could hear the whispering again. Louder now. It wasn't just in my head, it was real. "Come closer." I stumbled backward, the words searing into my mind like a command I couldn't ignore. I didn't want to obey. I didn't want to listen, but my body moved of its own accord. I reached the bed, my hands trembling as I picked up the journal and began flipping through the pages. It was a record written by someone who had lived in this house long before me. The entries spoke of rituals, of things seen and heard in the dark, of an entity that had been called forth from beyond the veil. There were drawings, strange symbols and marks I couldn't recognize, but it was the words that got to me. Asterisk, the door has been opened. It cannot be closed, asterisk. I read the line again, my breath catching in my throat. A door? A door to what? The room seemed to darken further, the shadows stretching longer, deeper. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the air grow thick around me, pressing in on my chest. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and I felt something cold brush against my skin. Something, someone was standing behind me. I could feel it. I didn't need to turn around to know, but I did anyway. And when I did, I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, its features indistinct like smoke, but its eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. They burned with an intensity that froze me in place, rooting me to the spot. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but watch as it drew closer. The air around it was thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was a low whisper, but it felt like it was vibrating through my very bones. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but I couldn't. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence all around me. The air was suffocating, and I thought I might pass out from the pressure. "You belong to us now." The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure reaching out toward me, its hand cold as ice. Then nothing. Everything was quiet. But in the distance, I could hear the faintest sound. A knock, slow and steady, echoing through the darkness. "Come home." And I knew then with absolute certainty that I would never be free. Not now. Not ever. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath. My hands shot up to my face, feeling the cold sweat that clung to my skin. My chest ached, and my heart hammered in my chest as if I'd been running for miles. But I wasn't running. I was here, in the house. The room felt suffocating. My eyes scanned the shadows, my breath shaky, unsure if what I'd just experienced had been real or a product of my mind cracking under the pressure of everything that had happened. The bed was empty. No figure. No cold hand. But the air was thick with something I couldn't quite place. I tried to sit up, but the pain in my head made it difficult to focus. The journal. I had to find it. The book I had been reading just before everything went dark. But as I reached out to grab it from the nightstand, I noticed something odd. The room had changed. The walls seemed to be closer, the ceiling lower. The air felt heavier, pressing against me like a physical force. I could see the faintest flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, something darting just out of sight whenever I turned my head. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog that still clung to my mind. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The house felt alive, like it was breathing with me, feeding off my fear. The journal was gone. I stood up, unsteady on my feet, and stumbled toward the door. It creaked loudly as I opened it, the sound echoing through the hallway. But when I stepped outside the room, something stopped me. The house was different. The hallway stretched out longer than it had before. The walls looked darker, like they were shifting under the weight of time. The paintings that had once lined the walls were now gone, leaving only faded impressions where they once hung. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked with every step, but it was different now, almost as if they were groaning in protest. I froze. I could hear it. Footsteps. Soft at first, barely a whisper against the old wood. But they were there, and they were moving closer. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I searched for something to defend myself with. There was nothing, just the cold, empty hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The footsteps were unmistakable now, slow, deliberate, as if the person or thing was drawing nearer, waiting to make its move. I turned back toward the room, ready to run back inside and lock myself in, but before I could, I heard a voice. A whisper. Low, soft, and unmistakable. "You can't hide from us." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. Just the empty hallway, dark and silent. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I could feel eyes on me piercing through the darkness. I backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't do this anymore. But just as I turned to run, I heard the footsteps again. Closer now. And then, another sound. A door opening. I whipped around, my eyes wide in terror, and saw the door to the living room standing ajar. The space beyond was dark, shrouded in shadows, but I could make out a faint light flickering from the corner. A candle? A lamp? I wasn't sure, but I had to know. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward the door. The air was thick now, almost suffocating, and the house seemed to be pressing in on me from all sides. I stepped over the threshold, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. The room was dimly lit by a single candle, its flame flickering in the breeze that wasn't there. I felt a sudden rush of dread flood my veins. Something was wrong. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. The journal. It lay on the table in front of me, its pages open. The same journal I had seen before, the one that had warned me about the door being opened. But something was different this time. The handwriting on the pages had changed. It no longer spoke of rituals or strange occurrences. Now, the words seemed to be written directly to me. You should have listened. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and turned the pages. They were filled with strange symbols, lines that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. But there, at the very end of the journal, was a new entry, dated just days before I moved in. Asterisk, they are coming for you. They have already taken root inside the house. And you will be the next one to fall, asterisk. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I backed away from the table, my head spinning. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in tighter, the air heavier. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were not coming from behind me. They were coming from inside the house. From upstairs. I could hear them, loud and distinct now. Heavy steps, like something dragging its feet across the floor. The floorboards groaned under the weight, the sound reverberating through the walls. My heart slammed in my chest, and I knew deep down that whatever was in this house wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just some strange occurrence. It was something far worse. I turned toward the door, ready to run, but then I heard a voice, soft and low, barely a whisper. You can't leave. I froze. It was close. Too close. I turned around slowly, my breath caught in my throat, and saw it. The figure was standing in the doorway. The same figure I had seen before. Tall, dark, and indistinct. But this time it wasn't just standing there. It was moving. closer. And then it spoke again, its voice like gravel scraping against bone. Welcome home. The last thing I remember was the cold hand on my shoulder, a grip that sent a shock of ice through my entire body. And then everything went black. Again. And I knew as I lost consciousness that there was no escaping this place. No running. No hiding. I was theirs now. Forever. I woke up again, but this time there was no uncertainty. No grogginess, no confusion. I was fully aware, as if some part of me had always been awake even when my body was unconscious. The room was dark, but there was no comforting quiet this time, only the deep, unsettling silence that felt suffocating. I lay there still waiting. Something was wrong, but I couldn't place it. The usual creaks of the house, the low hum of the old pipes, none of it was there. It was as if the house itself had fallen completely still, holding its breath along with me. I reached up to touch my head, my fingers meeting the familiar coolness of the bed frame. But something was different. The bed was softer than usual, like it was covered with a thick layer of dust. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen dust in this room. Then it hit me. The smell. It wasn't the usual musty scent of the house. No, this was something far more distinct. Rotting wood, something old and decaying, mingled with the coppery tang of blood. I shot up from the bed, my body moving before I could even think. My heart raced in my chest, louder now, the thrum of panic pushing me to move, to run, to get out of this place before it consumed me whole. But when I reached for the door, I realized it wasn't where I remembered it being. The room was different again, just like before. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower, and the hallway outside was dark, far too dark. The faint light from the candle in the living room no longer seemed comforting. It felt like a trap. I moved towards the door, hands shaking. But before I could touch the doorknob, the air shifted. A low hum began to vibrate the air around me. It wasn't a sound I could hear with my ears, it was something deeper, more visceral. The vibrations went through my skin, through my bones, rattling my very soul. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me, and fell onto the bed. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut as if that would make everything go away. But the hum only grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the door to my room swung open with a deafening creak. I blinked rapidly, my heart leaping into my throat, and saw it. The figure. It stood just beyond the doorway, taller than I remembered, its form shifting in and out of focus, like a wisp of smoke, but darker, darker than anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't entirely transparent either. Its presence seemed to warp the space around it, twisting the air, distorting everything it touched. I could feel its eyes on me. I couldn't see them, but I felt them, the weight of them burning into me, pushing me down into the bed. The house had gone completely silent, save for the thrumming of the figure's energy, as if it was feeding off the tension in the air. And then it spoke. You have awoken it. The voice was deep, resonating, and full of malice. It was not a voice from the figure. It seemed to come from everywhere, filling the room, surrounding me like a thick fog. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run away, but my body refused to move. It was as though my muscles had frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I forced my eyes open, the air around me growing colder. I could see it more clearly now, the figure taking shape in the dark. Its face a shadow, its limbs too long, stretched unnaturally. But it wasn't just the figure that was horrifying. It was everything around it. The walls had started to change again, this time warping in grotesque, unnatural angles, like the house was bending under the weight of the thing that had come back. The furniture, once so familiar, was now scattered and broken. Pieces of wood and fabric torn as if something violent had passed through here. The smell of decay was stronger now, cloying, choking the air. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but my throat felt like it was filled with gravel. The words wouldn't come. The figure stepped closer. It was always here, it whispered, its voice like a distant thunderclap, sending vibrations through my entire body. Asterisk, it's the house. It's the land. The door was always open. You are just the next to enter, asterisk. My pulse hammered in my temples and my breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The figure reached out its arm, its fingers stretching impossibly long, and I saw something moving in the darkness behind it. Shadows wriggled and twisted, like snakes in the dark, circling the figure, feeding off its energy. Then I felt it, a coldness, a sharp, biting coldness that wrapped around my chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. It felt like hands clawing at me from the inside, like something was trying to rip me apart. My body jerked against the invisible force, but it held me in place. I tried to scream. I tried to beg, to plead, to do anything to make it stop. But it was too late. The figure's face seemed to appear out of the blackness, its features vague but horrifying, a twisted mockery of a human face, eyes hollow and empty, an expression frozen in a silent scream. And then it was gone. The room went silent again. But the silence was worse now, like the calm before a storm, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't stay here anymore. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain that shot through my legs, and ran toward the door. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I couldn't stay here, couldn't let it get any closer. The hallway stretched before me longer than I remembered, darker than ever. My footsteps echoed against the floorboards, loud in the stillness. But then a door slammed somewhere behind me. I turned. The sound had come from downstairs. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was coming. And in that moment I realized something terrifying. There was no escape. Whatever was in this house had already claimed me. The door had been opened and there was no closing it now. I couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to keep running, to flee as fast as I could, but the air was thick, heavy. It pressed against me, suffocating me. Every step I took felt like it led me deeper into the nightmare. The house was no longer just a building, it was a living, breathing entity, aware of my every move. The creaks of the floorboards seemed to follow me, whispering in my ears, like the house itself was taunting me. I turned again, looking back toward the door at the end of the hallway. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. I could hear them now, heavy, deliberate steps that echoed like thunder in the silence. Whoever, or whatever, was moving through the house wasn't trying to be stealthy. It was coming for me, and there was no place left to hide. I tried the door at the end of the hall, the one that led to the staircase. Locked. Of course it was locked. The house had always kept me trapped in its grip, always made sure that escape was just out of reach. I pounded on the door with my fists, desperate to break through, but it wouldn't give. It wasn't just the lock, it was the house itself. The door wouldn't open because the house didn't want it to. The footsteps grew louder still, now joined by a low, guttural sound, a whispering, hissing noise that made my skin crawl. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt the cold sweat begin to beat on my forehead. I turned back to the hallway looking for any other way out, but there was nothing. The walls seemed to close in, the narrow space growing smaller, more claustrophobic with each passing second. The air grew colder too, until I could see my breath misting in the dim light. But it wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, that makes you feel like you're being frozen from the inside out. And then I heard it again, the door slamming. But this time it wasn't from downstairs. It was from behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, heart pounding. The door to the room I had come from, the one I had just fled, was now wide open. The darkness beyond it seemed to stretch out, a void pulling me in. And from within that darkness, something moved. I couldn't see what it was, but I could feel it, crawling out of the shadows like some kind of living nightmare. The air shifted as it passed, the temperature dropping even further, until it felt like I was standing in the very depths of winter. The footsteps were almost upon me now. I didn't know what to do. I had nowhere to run, no way to fight back. I was trapped in a house that had a mind of its own, a house that knew my every move, a house that had been waiting for me, watching me. And now, whatever was in the shadows was coming for me too. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the old floorboards as I stumbled down the hall. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs shaking with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. I just had to keep running, had to get out, had to. Bang. The door to the room behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, and I nearly fell. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't want to know what had made that sound. I just ran faster, faster, my heart in my throat, my head spinning. I could hear the footsteps behind me growing louder, faster, like they were closing in. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape them. I reached the staircase. The steps were slick with dust, and I almost lost my footing as I tried to make my way down, my hands gripping the banister for support. I could hear something shifting upstairs, something moving. The house wasn't empty. It was full of things that shouldn't be. I reached the bottom, my breath coming in harsh, desperate gasps. The front door was just ahead, a faint sliver of light shining through the cracks. But it seemed so far away. It felt like I had been running for hours, but I hadn't gotten any closer. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle. But it wouldn't turn. It was locked. The house was locking me in, keeping me here just like it always had. The doorknob wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I twisted. I slammed my shoulder against the door, hoping to break through, but the door didn't even give. And then I heard it, a sound like scraping nails on wood. Slow, deliberate, as if something, or someone, was dragging its fingers along the walls. It was coming from behind me. I turned, heart racing, my hands shaking as I searched the dark corners of the hallway. The shadows were deep, thick, moving like living things, swirling around me, pressing in closer. My skin crawled with the sensation that something was watching me. And then I saw it. A shape in the darkness, something that was not quite human. It stood at the top of the stairs, its head tilted at an impossible angle, its eyes black and empty, staring right at me. Its mouth opened slowly, but no sound came out, just the deafening silence that wrapped itself around me like a choking fog. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. The figure started to move toward me, slowly, purposefully, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. With each step, the darkness around it seemed to grow, to swallow everything else, until all I could see was that horrible, distorted face. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I wanted to run, to escape, but it was too late. The house was alive, and it was going to keep me. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, as though the weight of the house itself was pressing down on me, forcing the air from my lungs. The figure at the top of the stairs loomed larger with each passing second, its presence sucking the warmth from the room. The shadows around it were thick, almost liquid, slithering along the walls like something alive. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring my terror, relishing in my helplessness. The cold in the air intensified, a biting frost that made my teeth chatter. My legs were frozen, unwilling to carry me forward or backward. My body had betrayed me. Every nerve screamed to run, to escape, but my feet refused to obey. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs, its feet making no sound on the worn wooden steps. It moved toward me with an eerie grace, its head still tilted at that unnatural angle. Its black, hollow eyes never left mine. I could feel the darkness around it, the oppressive weight of something ancient, something evil, and it was closing in on me. I forced my body to move, one step, then another, my movements stiff and jerky, as though I were trapped in a dream I couldn't wake from. The cold seeped into my skin, making it hard to think. The only thing I could focus on was the figure, its distorted body slowly advancing toward me, closer and closer. I was almost to the door when I heard the faintest sound, something subtle, almost inaudible. A whisper. It wasn't words, but a low, guttural hum vibrating through the air, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze. The figure stopped, its head cocking to the side as if it had heard something too. Then the whisper grew louder. "Leave now." The voice, cold and raspy, filled the room, coming from everywhere at once. I turned, trying to find the source, but the house seemed to be shifting around me, warping like some kind of living nightmare. The walls groaned in protest, the floorboards creaked underfoot. It felt as though the house itself was alive, reacting to the presence of the creature, its pulse quickening, its breath growing shallow. And then I saw it. A doorway at the far end of the hallway, one that had been hidden from view before, as though the house itself had willed it into existence. It was a heavy wooden door, its surface marked with strange, indecipherable symbols. The whispering grew louder, urging me to move toward it, to open it. I didn't hesitate. The door was my only chance. I sprinted toward it, my hands trembling as I grabbed the doorknob. It was cold, colder than anything I had felt before. With a force I didn't know I had left, I wrenched the door open, the sound of creaking hinges filling the air. Beyond the door was a room I had never seen before. It was a small, dimly lit space, its walls lined with old, crumbling bookshelves. The room was suffocating, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. In the center of the room stood an old, rotting desk covered in dust. Papers were scattered across the surface, their edges curled and yellowed with age. But it was what lay atop the desk that made my blood run cold. A book. It was open, its pages filled with strange symbols and markings, drawn in what looked like blood. The air around it seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very room itself was alive. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, urging me to take the book, to read its pages, to understand its secrets. I didn't want to. I knew what it would cost me, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't resist. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edges of the book, and the moment I touched it, the room seemed to explode in light. The whispers stopped. The cold was gone. The figure, whatever it was gone. And for the first time since entering this cursed house, I felt like I could breathe again. But I knew better than to think it was over. I dropped the book, my hands shaking, my heart racing. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but as I stepped back into the hallway, everything changed. The walls seemed to close in on me, the ceiling pressing down, the air thick with an overwhelming pressure. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, as though it might collapse at any moment. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled my head, drowning out everything else. Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk. The words echoed in my mind, filling me with dread. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to flee, but the hallway had changed. It was no longer the same familiar space I had once known. It was a labyrinth, twisting and turning in on itself. The doors I had passed earlier were now gone. The windows were sealed shut. I was trapped. I could feel it now, the weight of the house's curse. It wasn't just the figure. It wasn't just the strange sounds or the cold. It was the house itself, alive, feeding off my fear. It was aware of me, watching me, waiting. I ran, but it didn't matter. I was never meant to leave. The house had claimed me just as it had claimed all the others before me. And no matter how hard I fought, no matter how desperately I screamed for help, it would never let me go. The house was hungry, and it had only just begun to feed. And somewhere in the darkness, I could hear its voice, soft and insistent, like a lullaby in the night. Asterisk, welcome home. Asterisk. And with that, I knew the truth. The house would always have a place for me. The walls pressed in tighter, the very air thick and oppressive, as if the house were smothering me, choking the life from my lungs. I stumbled through the darkened hallway, my hands outstretched, searching for something, anything, that would lead me to an exit, or at least a sign that I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. But the house had already made its decision. I could feel its presence all around me, coiling in the corners, watching me from the shadows. It was as though the house itself had become sentient, aware of my every movement, every thought. Each step I took was a step deeper into its clutches, and no matter how fast I ran, it was always one step ahead. The whispers, those damnable whispers, filled my ears again, their words indecipherable but filled with malice, urging me to turn back, to submit. My head swam with the sounds, each syllable a dagger to my sanity, each breath a struggle against the crushing weight of fear. I stumbled into a room, one I hadn't seen before. The air was thick with dust, the curtains drawn tight against whatever light might have once filtered in. A small, dim light flickered from a corner, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. It was the only source of light, and I couldn't look away from it, as though it had some strange power over me. The room itself was empty except for a single chair in the center, its wood darkened by age, its cushions worn and threadbare. And sitting in that chair, no lying in it, was a figure. It was human but not quite. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow, black pits staring into nothingness. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, a piercing stare that burned into my very soul. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my feet cemented to the floor by an unseen force. My heart hammered in my chest, and I swallowed hard, trying to force air into my lungs that refused to fill. The figure in the chair didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating. I could feel the weight of its existence pressing in on me. It was a part of the house, just as the house was a part of it. The two were one now, bound by some dark, twisted force. As I stood there, frozen, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a maddening crescendo. I felt as though my mind was being pulled apart, torn in two. I fought to keep my focus, to stay grounded in reality, but it was slipping away like sand through my fingers. And then, with a jolt, I was no longer in the room. I was somewhere else, somewhere darker. The room around me faded into shadow, and the walls began to close in. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, until I could see my breath fog in front of me. I was standing in the hallway again, but it was no longer the same. The house had shifted, warped, as if it were alive, rearranging itself around me. The door at the end of the hallway beckoned, its surface cracked and splintered, but I knew better than to approach it. The house was leading me somewhere. Somewhere I didn't want to go. I backed away, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps that followed me were heavy, deliberate, each one echoing through the hall like a death knell. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The house, it seemed, was empty. Or at least I thought it was. I froze when I heard it, the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned around, but the hallway stretched endlessly, the walls narrowing with every passing second. The dark shape that had been following me was gone, but I knew it was still there. I could feel it, a presence that clung to me like a shadow, lurking just out of sight. I ran again, my feet pounding against the wooden floor as the house seemed to shift and change around me. The walls stretched and twisted, the ceiling lowering, the floor rising beneath my feet. The house was alive, its hunger insatiable, and I was its prey. I ran and ran, the whispers louder now, until my head was spinning, until I could no longer tell where I was. The walls pressed in, the darkness thickened, and all I could hear was the sound of my own frantic breathing, mingling with the ever-present whisper that had become a part of me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I found it. The door. It was the same door that had led me to the room with the chair, the one that had drawn me in like a moth to the flame. The handle was cold, almost burning to the touch, but I didn't hesitate. I opened it, and on the other side was nothing. An endless void, black as pitch. There was no floor, no walls, only darkness that stretched infinitely in all directions. I felt my feet move, taking me toward the edge, and I wanted to scream to stop myself, but my body wouldn't obey. The house was in control now. I was just a passenger. I took another step, and then another, until I was standing on the edge of the abyss. The whispers surrounded me, now louder than ever, filling my mind with a single horrible thought. You're mine. The darkness reached up, swallowing me whole, and I felt myself falling deeper into the void. My body jerked, but it was as if I had no control anymore. I was lost in the house, lost to the house. And as I fell, I heard the whispers one last time. Welcome home. The last thing I felt was the cold. The unrelenting, bone-chilling cold that wrapped around me like a cocoon. And then, nothing. No more whispers. No more fear. Just silence.